Hello, night wanderer, settle in. Tonight on Moonlight Science, we're drifting far south, beyond the last lighthouse and into a memory the ice would rather keep. Long before glaciers groaned and katabatic winds sang, Antarctica was warm, green, and alive. Forests whispering under months of twilight, rivers braiding through ferny lowlands, reptiles basking where snow now rules. Breathe in, let your shoulders drop. Together, we'll unroll the planet's stone diary, page by gentle page, and visit a polar Eden that feels impossible until the rocks themselves begin to speak. When you look at a modern globe, your eyes slide down to the bottom of the world and meet a blank expanse of white. Antarctica sits there like a crown of silence, the final, frozen continent. On every classroom wall map, it's an afterthought, a flat smear at the edge of the projection, labeled only by lines of latitude and the emptiness between them. But maps lie quietly. They tell you where, not when. They make the world look still when, in truth, it is always moving. Continents are not fixed shapes. They are slow dancers, their steps measured in millimeters per year, their gestures spanning millions of human lifetimes. What we call Antarctica today is only a snapshot, a single frame in a story that stretches back hundreds of millions of years. If you could peel away the ice, beneath it lies a continent every bit as complex as any other. Mountains that rival the Alps, valleys deeper than the Grand Canyon, ancient rivers fossilized into rock. Once, those valleys weren't choked with glaciers, but filled with flowing water and fern forests. The land beneath the frozen crust holds the ghosts of roots and rivers, preserved like pressed flowers between pages of stone. To see it as it truly was, you must let the map melt. Imagine the ice retreating, the blue of the oceans rising, the green of life flooding southward. This is not fantasy. It's a memory written in rock. The ground beneath your feet right now is moving, carried on the slow current of tectonic plates. Over eons, these plates have broken and collided, dragging continents through every climate zone Earth can offer. Antarctica, too, has wandered. Once nestled near the equator as part of a supercontinent called Gondwana. It was not a lonely kingdom of snow, but a tropical neighbor to Africa, South America, India, and Australia. Together, they formed a single vast landscape of forests, swamps, and rivers, stretching from pole to pole. Where penguins now huddle against the cold, crocodiles once slid into murky water. The journey of this continent is a story of drift, of time stretched thin and patient. About 180 million years ago, Gondwana began to crack apart under the heat rising from within Earth's mantle. Imagine fissures glowing like molten seams, continents slowly unbuttoning themselves from one another. Antarctica drifted south, inch by inch, carried by convection currents beneath the crust. To human eyes, it would have seemed still, but in deep time it glided like an enormous raft through changing seas. The climate followed the dance. Humid forests giving way to temperate woodlands, then to tundra, and finally to the silence of ice. Yet even when it reached its polar position, warmth lingered longer than you'd expect. For millions of years after settling at the bottom of the world, Antarctica was still green. The ocean currents that today rapid and cold had not yet formed, and the atmosphere was heavy with greenhouse gases that kept the planet's breath warm. Rivers braided through valleys. Rain fell in soft curtains for months at a time. The land pulsed with seasons of light and dark. 6 months of sunlight that never set, followed by 6 months of dim twilight, never entirely black. When we think of the poles, we think of desolation. But the Earth's climate is not constant. It's a painter that never finishes a canvas. Sometimes it adds ice, sometimes it peels it away. The white expanse you see on your map is just one layer of paint. Beneath it, other layers wait, layers where forests once rustled, where soil was soft underfoot, where life thrived in colors that no human has ever seen. A compass can tell you where you stand, but without time, you'll never know what stands beneath you. So tonight, let's trade latitude for time. Let's let the continents move, the oceans breathe, the clouds shift, and the temperature rise. Let's watch the South Pole drift backward through the ages until its face changes entirely. The ice melts, the rivers return, the forests breathe again, and the map, once so still, begins to move like a living thing. Geology is the planet's clock, and every rock is a tick of its second hand. When you press your palm against ancient stone, you are touching motion itself, frozen mid-gesture. To read the story of Antarctica, we must learn to hear those ticks, to translate them into seasons, forests, and floods. Because the world beneath our feet is not static. It changes, it adapts, and it remembers. And if we listen closely enough, we might just hear what the map cannot show us. The heartbeat of a tropical paradise sleeping beneath the snow. Long before it became a frozen symbol of isolation, Antarctica was a bridge, a living artery of the world. The land we call the southernmost continent once sat at the heart of Gondwana, the vast supercontinent that sprawled across much of the planet's southern hemisphere. It was a land stitched together, not by ice, but by forests and rivers. Imagine it as a single, breathing organism. Africa forming the torso, South America the arm, India the reaching hand, Australia the other limb, and Antarctica the backbone. Steady, connected, and strong. The wind that swept across it carried the scents of resin and moss, not salt and frost. In this ancient age, the earth was warmer, more humid, and heavy with carbon dioxide. Lush green spread across the continents in unbroken carpets of vegetation. Towering tree ferns and early conifers shaded wetlands where dragonflies the size of gulls flickered through the air. The continents weren't divided by frozen seas, but by winding rivers that joined and rejoined like veins under living skin. Across what is now Antarctica, streams fed into vast deltas, spilling nutrients into shallow inland seas. Each tide left behind layers of silt and decaying plants, raw material that would, over millions of years, harden into coal. Those seams still lie beneath the ice, black ribbons recording the memory of forests that once flourished under the southern sun. Animals, too, wandered freely. Early reptiles and amphibians moved between what are now separate continents, unaware that the ground beneath them was slowly tearing apart. Fossils found in South Africa match those discovered deep within the transantarctic mountains, identical species frozen in rock thousands of kilometers apart. Even the magnetic minerals in those stones point in the same direction, like compass needles frozen in agreement, a geological confession that these lands were once one. These are the fingerprints of Gondwana, the proof that Antarctica was never meant to be alone. The air of the Permian and Triassic periods was thick with life's experimentation. Strange creatures roamed the fern jungles and riverbanks. Sail-backed reptiles basking in humid light, amphibians the length of cars wallowing in slow-moving streams. Farther inland, forests stretched across gentle hills, where the dawn calls of primitive insects filled the air with a constant tremor. The landscape was green, but not yet familiar. Alien in its abundance, every plant and animal an early draft of what evolution would later refine. Antarctica was not the empty white desert we know, but a canvas of color and sound. And yet, even in this lush world, the seeds of change were already stirring. Beneath the ground, Heat built up along hidden fractures. Pressure gathered, like breath before a word. The tectonic plates that carried Gondwana's weight began to tremble and shift. Slowly, invisibly, the land cracked. At first, the fissures were small, mere wrinkles in a vast skin. But over millions of years, they deepened into valleys, and valleys became oceans. Magma rose and cooled, creating new rock, new boundaries, new fates. The supercontinent began to drift apart, and the world's familiar outlines started to take shape. For the creatures living then, the change was imperceptible. A mountain range rose so slowly that no generation ever noticed it grow. A river's course shifted over centuries, carving a new path with patient persistence. But to the eye of deep time, the transformation was unstoppable. Gondwana's great forests broke apart like pages torn from a book. The continents began to travel separate roads, each carrying fragments of their shared story. Antarctica, heavy and ancient, drifted southward toward the pole, where the sun's warmth would one day fade, and the first whispers of frost would begin to fall. Even as it began its slow journey toward isolation, life clung to the land. New species evolved in the shifting climates. Where volcanic ash fell, it fed the soil, and green quickly reclaimed the blackened ground. Rivers continued to weave through valleys, feeding deltas thick with reeds and early cycads. To stand there would have been to witness a continent in motion, not through earthquakes or storms, but through the patient rearrangement of entire worlds. Every gust of wind, every ripple of water, was part of a rhythm far older than any heartbeat. The clues of this ancient unity remain hidden in the rock record. Across continents that are now oceans apart, geologists find identical mountain belts, like scars that match perfectly when the puzzle is pieced together. Fossilized ferns known as Glossopteris, with their distinct leaf patterns, appear from South America to India to Antarctica, telling the same quiet story in every layer of stone. These echoes of a shared past are what allow us to see beyond the frozen illusion of today's world map. Antarctica wasn't an end, it was a middle, a connection point in Earth's unfolding symphony. When you trace the seams of Gondwana, you begin to see the planet not as separate continents, but as a single, restless being, forever reassembling itself. The boundaries we draw are temporary. The shapes we memorize are fleeting. And deep beneath the ice of Antarctica, beneath the silence and the snow, the rocks still hum with memory. They remember forests, warmth, and movement. They remember being part of something vast, alive, and whole. Before the cold came, before the white curtain fell, the southernmost land was a heart still beating at the center of the world. The sun never truly set, not the way it does for us. In the deep time Antarctica of the Mesozoic, light lingered like a dream that refused to end. For months, the sky would glow in a golden haze that never darkened beyond twilight. Shadows stretched long and soft across the ground, and the trees, tall, resin-scented conifers and hardy deciduous species, learned to live by this slow rhythm. They grew in pulses, not days. During the endless summer, they surged upward, adding ring after ring of new wood. When the light thinned to a long dusk, they rested but never fully slept. They had found a way to breathe in half darkness. Walk through that forest in your mind. Beneath the canopy, the air is warm and damp, heavy with the smell of moss and decaying leaves. Ferns brush your legs, their fronds beaded with dew that never quite dries. Somewhere, unseen, water murmurs over stones, fed by rain that has no schedule. The forest floor glows faintly with patches of fungus, feeding on fallen logs, knitting the roots below into an underground web of life. Every tree is connected by these fungal threads, exchanging nutrients and signals. Silent conversation carried through the soil. Above, the light shifts slowly, but never dies. These polar forests were not like the ones we know. They had to solve the problem of time itself. Without regular day and night, how do you decide when to open your leaves or drop them? How do you tell one season from another when the sun forgets to set? The answer lies in the faint variations of light intensity, the angle of the sun, and the whispers of temperature that still rose and fell in long, shallow waves. Plants developed internal calendars, not tied to the clock of hours, but to the broader pulse of the year. Some trees shed their leaves for a brief dormancy. Others stayed evergreen, conserving energy through the dim months until the light returned in earnest. This delicate rhythm left traces in the wood itself. Fossilized trunks discovered in Antarctica still carry the record, rings spaced unevenly, revealing years of abundance and years of restraint. Wide bands mark summers when warmth and light were generous. Narrow ones show when growth slowed, when shadows lingered longer and the air grew cooler. These stumps stand today where they once rooted, preserved in place, proof that entire forests once grew where ice now reigns. Their presence tells us that the challenge of the polar world was not cold, it was endurance. Life learned to thrive on patience. Insects thrived here too, their buzzing chorus filling the dim hours. Beetles nibbled at bark, dragonflies skimmed the open pools, and delicate wings caught the low light like fragments of stained glass. Their bodies, pressed into layers of mudstone, reveal a diversity that could only have existed in a rich, stable ecosystem. Some may have pollinated early seed plants, others recycled decay back into the soil. The forest hummed with invisible labor, each creature playing a role in the quiet machinery of life. Even under these warm skies, darkness still came, but softly. For months, the sun sank below the horizon, and the land fell into a twilight that never reached full blackness. Snow didn't fall, but mist curled low between the trunks, and frost might have touched the leaves before melting at noon when the sun brushed the horizon again. The forest didn't die during these long nights. It slowed. Metabolisms dimmed like lanterns turned low. Sap moved sluggishly in the trunks. Animals sought burrows, relying on fat reserves and stored warmth. Time stretched thin, but it did not break. Imagine standing there, the ground soft with ancient leaf litter, the air cool and still, the horizon glowing faintly like a candle behind a curtain. You could wait hours or centuries, and the scene would barely change. This was a world without hurry. Growth was measured not in seasons, but in geological patience. Every fern, every mushroom, every towering tree existed as part of a long, slow exhale. And yet, for all its calm, the forest was alive with transition. When the long light returned, green flushed through the landscape almost overnight. Buds cracked open, rivers swelled, insects hatched in shimmering clouds, and the air once again filled with the scent of life reborn. Light and dark wove through each year like a heartbeat, steady and ancient. These forests remind us that polar has never meant lifeless. Warmth and vitality once reached even the ends of the earth, adapting to the rhythms of tilted light. The stumps we find today are their signatures, silent but eloquent. Proof that life can root itself even in extremes, bending its rhythm to the shape of the sky. Under the midnight sun, Antarctica learned to live without true day or night, its forests breathing in slow time, waiting for the world to turn again. In the cold silence of Antarctica's rocks lies a leaf that has outlasted continents. It is small, flattened, and delicate, yet it holds a story large enough to bind half the planet together. The leaf belongs to Glossopteris, a plant that once carpeted Gondwana's ancient landscapes in thick, dark green forests. Its shape is unmistakable, broad and tapering, like a tongue of polished jade. When pressed into shale and revealed millions of years later, it looks almost alive, as if it could still flutter in a humid breeze. That single pattern, repeated from India to Australia to South America to Antarctica, is the signature of a vanished world. In the Permian period, long before ice claimed the southern pole, the land that would become Antarctica was a realm of slow rivers and endless wetlands. The air was cool but heavy with moisture, and rain fell often, soft and persistent, feeding sprawling deltas where Glossopteris took root. The plant grew thickly, forming dense stands that stretched for kilometers. Its leaves grew broad to catch the low, slanting sunlight of high latitudes. When they fell, they gathered in deep mats of decay, layer upon layer, blanketing the ground like a carpet of dark gold. Over millions of years, these layers would compress, burying the memory of forests beneath new sediments until they hardened into coal. Those black seams, still hidden beneath Antarctic ice, are proof that this land once lived and breathed under a canopy of green. Coal is more than just fuel. It's time made tangible. Each lump is the condensed shadow of ancient sunlight, energy trapped when Glossopteris leaves absorbed warmth and light in a world that no longer exists. When scientists split open coal seams in the trans-Antarctic mountains, they find not just carbon, but texture, fragments of stems, veins of roots, even spores from the surrounding ferns. The earth remembers in layers. The deeper you dig, the warmer and wetter the story becomes. What made Glossopteris remarkable was not only its abundance, but its reach. Its fossils appear on continents now separated by vast oceans, as though scattered by some impossible wind. Early geologists, puzzled by this global pattern, used its presence to argue for the existence of Gondwana, long before plate tectonics was understood. They realized that these distant lands must once have been joined, sharing rivers, climate, and soil. A single leaf had become the first clue in unraveling how the continents drifted apart. In a way, Glossopteris was the bridge between continents, both in life and in death. To picture these ancient forests, imagine the hum of insects over shallow pools, the croak of early amphibians echoing between trees. The ground is soft and damp, the air rich with the scent of resin and decay. Glossopteris trees stand shoulder to shoulder, their trunks rising from spongy peat. They shed their leaves each year in response to the long polar night, an ancient rhythm tuned not to temperature but to light. When the months of twilight came, the forest turned amber, and the ground glowed beneath the dim sun. It was a slow-motion autumn that blanketed the continent in gold before the long dusk. When the sun returned, life exploded back into motion. New leaves unfurled, dragonflies hovered over the flooded plains, and small reptilian creatures scurried between the roots. The forest pulsed with the rhythm of extremes: long light, long dark, constant moisture, and patient endurance. The plants thrived not in spite of their environment, but because of it. They were adapted to uncertainty, to cycles of abundance and pause. And then, as the continents began to drift and climate shifted, the Glossopteris world started to vanish. Volcanic activity darkened the skies. Temperatures fell. Rivers froze in winter and failed to thaw completely in spring. The same resilience that had once allowed the forests to thrive now could not save them. Layer by layer, the leaves fell for the last time, settling into the mud that would one day turn to stone. The forests died, but their impressions remained. millions of tiny fossils pressed flat, immortal signatures in shale. To hold one of those fossils today is to touch deep time directly. The fine veins of the leaf, still visible after 250 million years, trace the paths where sap once flowed. Each vein carried sunlight transformed into sugar, energy that fed a living forest beneath stars that no longer shine in the same constellations. The faint sheen of the fossil, the texture of its surface, is not just a remnant, it's a message. It says that Antarctica was once warm enough for trees to breathe, that rain once fell where ice now reigns, that the ground we call dead once pulsed with life. When you lay your finger against a Glossopteris imprint, you're bridging time. You're touching a forest that grew when reptiles ruled the wetlands and the continents were one. The leaf beneath your fingertip is both fragile and eternal, a memory pressed into stone that whispers of warmth, rain, and the resilience of life. Beneath Antarctica's ice, under miles of frozen silence, those leaves are still there. Billions of them, waiting in darkness, keeping the secret of a green and breathing world that once thrived under polar stars. The rivers of ancient Antarctica no longer flow, but their paths are still written across the stone. If you could peel away the ice and trace the land beneath, you would find channels winding like veins across a buried landscape, curving, branching, looping back on themselves in quiet elegance. These were once living rivers, braided and restless, running southward through forests of Glossopteris and ferns, through valleys green and humid beneath a sun that hovered low on the horizon. They were not trickles under frost, but torrents born from monsoon rains and mountain melt, carrying the lifeblood of a continent. Stand there in imagination, millions of years ago, and you would hear them. The murmur of water against stone, the buzz of insects hovering above it, the distant rumble of thunder rolling over endless floodplains. During the wet seasons, storms would sweep in from the north, filling the rivers until they overflowed their banks and spilled across the forest floor. Silt and clay clouded the current, swirling in brown ribbons that gleamed in the diffuse polar light. Fallen logs drifted slowly downstream, carrying clumps of moss and the occasional insect, small passengers on their way to the deltas and inland seas. In drier years, the waters thinned but never vanished. The air grew still, and the channels divided into smaller threads, weaving through sandbars and oxbows. Along their edges, amphibians lurked half-hidden in shadow, their slick eyes watching for prey. Dragonflies skated over the glassy pools, their wings trembling with sunlight. Reptiles sunned themselves on gravel bars, their bodies glistening with moisture, while the forest beyond murmured with the sounds of unseen life. These rivers were not just features of the land. They were its voice. Each rise and fall in their flow was a note in the continent's slow symphony. Geologists reading the record of those waters find their signatures preserved in remarkable detail. Ripple marks ripple still, delicate wave patterns pressed into rock, frozen mid-motion. Pebbles, rounded smooth by the patient tumbling of current, lie embedded in sandstone where no hand has touched them for hundreds of millions of years. In some places, cross-bedded layers reveal the shifting of currents, recording which direction the river once flowed. In others, wide channels now filled with stone show where the water carved deep, powerful paths through fertile valleys. Together, they tell a story of energy and rhythm, of a world in constant motion even at its coldest edges. Antarctica's rivers once tied its ecosystems together. They carried nutrients from upland forests into lowland swamps, spreading sediments rich with decayed plants that would one day form coal. They carried spores and seeds far beyond where they first sprouted, giving life a chance to wander. Fish and amphibians followed these currents, their populations spreading between regions, connecting distant habitats into one vast living web. The rivers were the threads of continuity, always flowing, always shaping. Even when continents began to shift apart, the marks of these waterways remained behind, etched into the ground like memories that refused to fade. When the first ice sheets came, they did not erase the rivers entirely. The glaciers bulldozed through valleys, grinding stone and soil into powder. Yet, in many places, the frozen masses followed the old river paths. Ice, too, seeks the low ground. It crept along the same channels that once carried warm rain, deepening them, reshaping them, preserving them in the process. Beneath the miles of modern ice, radar now reveals these ghostly networks. Hidden tributaries, buried deltas, even whole lake basins sealed away in darkness. Some of those ancient waterways may still carry liquid water, locked in secret circulation under the pressure and heat of the overlying ice. The rivers never truly died. They simply changed form. To imagine their past is to imagine motion in a landscape we think of as still. Picture a vast floodplains under the pale sun, its waters glinting like veins of silver. Ferns bend under the weight of heavy rain. Tree trunks lean into the current, roots gripping the muddy banks. Frogs croak from shadowed pools, and small reptiles slip soundlessly beneath the surface. The river is alive, its currents breathing through the land, shaping every valley, nourishing every seed. Even now, when scientists split open ancient sandstone or drill through layers of ice, they uncover traces of that flow. Grains sorted by size, pebbles stacked by current, minerals aligned like compass needles pointing downstream. The record of a single flood might be preserved for eternity, the pulse of water caught mid-beat. In those quiet rocks, the echo of the river remains. It speaks of warmth where there is now cold, of movement where there is stillness, of a world that once ran liquid and green. Every continent carries its scars and its songs. For Antarctica, the song is a river's lullaby, gentle, rhythmic, patient. It reminds us that even here, at the planet's coldest edge, there was once sound and motion, rain and renewal. And though the ice has silenced it for now, the river's pulse still beats faintly beneath, waiting for the warmth of another age to set it free again. The forests of ancient Antarctica did not whisper. They hummed. Beneath the slow pulse of rivers and the rustle of Glossopteris leaves, a smaller orchestra played on without pause. The air itself was alive with motion, a haze of wings glittering like dust in the amber light. These were the insects of the southern forests, unseen by any human eye, yet essential to every thread of life. Their fossils are fragile, but their presence is undeniable. Thin wings pressed into shale, minute mandibles fossilized in amber-like resin, and the faint scribbles of burrows etched into ancient wood. Each trace, though small, is a testament to abundance. If you could stand there, beneath the towering conifers, you would hear them long before you saw them. The drone of midges and the soft rattle of beetle shells would blend into a background murmur that filled every crevice of the forest. Swarms would rise at dusk, catching the golden light that slanted through the canopy. Beetles, their shells damp with dew, crept across bark in slow determination, carving trails through lichen and moss. Some chewed into fallen logs, recycling dead trees into rich soil. Others drilled into living wood, boring tunnels that weakened the trunks but strengthened the ecosystem. Decay in these forests was not an ending. It was a beginning. Every insect had a role. Pollinators moved between primitive seed ferns, carrying grains of pollen clinging to their legs. Scavengers fed on the bodies of the fallen, breaking them down before rot could take hold. Predators stalked the undergrowth, their compound eyes catching the faintest flicker of motion. And everywhere, herbivores nibbled, leaving behind their delicate handwriting on the leaves. Fossilized foliage still bears their marks. Tiny arcs, lacework patterns, and half-moon bites that speak of hunger and persistence. Each mark is a story of survival, of a creature no larger than a fingernail carving its place in a forest that reached to the heavens. When rain fell, and it often did, it turned the air into a mist of life. Swarms of midges danced above puddles that reflected endless green. Dragonflies the size of a child's hand darted through the gaps between trees, hunting smaller prey with precision. Ant-like insects scurried in the leaf litter, harvesting spores, seeds, and anything soft enough to chew. Worms and larvae tunneled through the damp soil, loosening it, letting air and water flow through. Together, these small architects transformed the forest floor into a living sponge that captured nutrients, moisture, and the breath of decay. Without them, the forest would have drowned in its own abundance. Fossils preserve only fragments of this symphony, yet those fragments are eloquent. In some layers of Antarctic shale, scientists have found mats of wings, delicate as lace, layered one atop another like pages in a forgotten book. These are not random scatterings, but the remains of swarms, entire generations that once rose into the air and fell back to Earth in a single season. In other places, the interiors of fossilized logs still bear the tunnels of wood-boring beetles, frozen mid-bite, their ancient carpentry preserved for eternity. There are even traces of fecal pellets, tiny, round signatures that confirm the cycle of life turning endlessly in the soil. To picture these insects in their prime is to imagine a world in constant motion, yet strangely peaceful. At twilight, the forest would glow with bioluminescent fungi, and against this dim light, clouds of flying insects shimmered like drifting embers. Their sound was neither loud nor quiet. It was everywhere, a steady, breathing presence that made the forest feel alive. Amphibians hunted them near riverbanks, tongues flashing in the half-light. Small reptiles snapped at them in the air. Even the fish in the slow, dark streams waited for the ones that landed on the surface, dimpling the water before vanishing in a ripple. What makes this scene so astonishing is its location. To imagine such teeming life under a polar sun challenges everything we associate with Antarctica. We think of silence, of emptiness, of wind howling over ice. But the rocks tell a different story, of buzzing, chewing, living abundance. The fossil record does not exaggerate, it whispers truth. The tiny punctures and bites preserved in stone say more than entire books ever could. They say that appetite existed here, that hunger was constant, that even in the farthest reaches of the earth, life was busy, industrious, relentless. The insects of ancient Antarctica were not grand or dramatic. They left no bones or towering skeletons. Yet their work was what allowed the great forests to flourish. They broke down the dead, pollinated the living, and laced the soil with nutrients that sustained the next generation. They were the quiet engineers of their world, and their world, in turn, shaped ours. When you look at a fossilized leaf from Antarctica and see those tiny scars, the half-moons, the scribbled edges, the faint pinholes, you are looking at proof of motion, proof of hunger, proof of life. It is a record of the moment an insect took a bite of green and continued the endless chain of creation and decay. A whisper across 250 million years, carried by wings that no longer buzz, but whose echo still fills the silence beneath the ice. In the deep south of deep time, where we now imagine only silence and snow, Shadows once moved along the banks of warm rivers. They were slow, deliberate, and ancient even then. Crocodiliforms, kin to the crocodiles that still haunt tropical waters today. Their tracks are pressed into sandstone and mudstone far within Antarctica's interior, preserved with the delicacy of fingerprints. Each impression tells of an animal heavy with muscle and patience, gliding through oxbow lakes and swampy shallows, a hunter perfectly attuned to warmth. Their presence alone rewrites what we think we know of the poles. This was not a frozen world. It was a realm of sunlit water and quiet danger. Picture it, a river curling through a forest that never truly sleeps. Its water is stained the color of tea from decaying leaves, shallow at the edges where reeds sway and insects flit. In the half-golden light of a polar summer, the surface ripples once, twice, then stills again. Beneath, the shadow slides forward, barely breaking the reflection of trees above. Crocodiliform eyes, narrow, amber, unblinking, watch for the slightest movement. When a dragonfly skims too close or an amphibian slips into the current, there's a sudden burst of motion, a splash, a pulse, and then silence. The forest returns to its steady hum, as if nothing happened. These reptiles lived where no crocodile could survive today. Their fossils, found within sediments once laid down at high southern latitudes, are small miracles of information. Bones, teeth, and even trackways lie interwoven with impressions of leaves and roots. From them, scientists reconstruct a world where the average temperature never fell below freezing and the rivers never froze. Winters may have brought months of twilight, but the air remained soft, the water liquid, the soil alive. The presence of such cold-blooded predators tells us more about climate than any mineral formula ever could. Crocodiles are honest witnesses. They do not tolerate frost. Where they thrived, warmth must have been constant. Alongside them swam turtles and amphibians, creatures equally dependent on heat and water. Together, they formed an ecosystem that would feel oddly familiar if you could stand within it. The calls of frogs echoed through the reeds. Turtles hauled themselves onto mud banks to bask. Insects hummed in clouds above the water. And somewhere, just out of sight, a crocodiliform waited, still as carved stone. The scene could be mistaken for a modern river in northern Australia or the Nile Delta. Except for the strange tilt of the light, the sun circling low around the horizon, never rising high, never setting. Fossilized footprints show how these reptiles moved through their world. Some tracks lead from one drying pool to another, hinting at a landscape of fluctuating water levels, wet seasons that flooded everything, followed by mild droughts when rivers shrank into winding channels. In one set of impressions, a larger individual crosses the path of a smaller one, their steps overlapping. It is easy to imagine the moment, perhaps a parent and juvenile moving together, or a hunt unfolding in slow motion millions of years ago. Time has erased everything, except the weight of their steps. To live at the pole required resilience, not resistance. These crocodile ancestors did not fight the darkness or the long days. They adapted to them. During months of perpetual daylight, they basked endlessly, conserving energy when food was plentiful. When twilight stretched across the land, their metabolism slowed, matching the cool rhythm of the season. Life at the edge of the world demanded patience, a trait crocodiles have carried through the ages, like a signature of survival. The discovery of these fossils was once met with disbelief. How could crocodiles exist in a place now buried under kilometers of ice? But the rocks are clear and unambiguous. They tell a story of warm rivers flowing under high latitudes, of ecosystems that mirrored tropical deltas, of predators lying in wait beneath polar ferns. Every trackway, every bone fragment adds weight to the same truth. Antarctica was once green, fertile, and alive. There is something strangely comforting in that realization. It connects the extremes of our planet in a single thread. The same lineage that basks on African riverbanks once watched the midnight sun turn the Antarctic sky into a copper glow. The same rhythm of hunger, patience, and sudden violence that animates today's crocodiles pulsed through their ancient kin. When you stand before those fossilized tracks, half buried in stone, it's easy to forget that they were made under a different sky entirely. The air was thick with the scent of vegetation, the rivers ran wide and slow, and the cold that would one day bury this land was still a distant rumor. The tracks lead nowhere now, ending abruptly where the rock breaks away. But once, they led to the water's edge, where a reptile slipped soundlessly into the current, leaving behind only ripples. Those ripples hardened into history, and in them, the shadow of warmth lingers still, whispering that even at the pole, the sun once belonged to crocodiles. When night fell in ancient Antarctica, it did not last a single evening, it lasted months. The sun dipped below the horizon and lingered there, circling unseen, casting only a dim twilight that stretched for half a year. Yet even in that long dusk, the forests were not silent. Beneath the canopy of conifers and ferns, something moved, quiet, alert, and alive. The dinosaurs of the South had learned the rhythm of this strange world. They were not the colossal giants that once thundered across deserts to the north. They were smaller, lighter, quick-thinking survivors, built not for dominance, but for endurance. Their bones, found in scattered layers of rock now locked under ice, tell us how they lived. Growth rings within the fossilized bone show a life patterned by extremes. Rapid expansion during the bright summers when food was plentiful. Then a pause, a narrow band of slower growth, when the long twilight settled over the land. These rings are not so different from the lines of a tree trunk, recording each year's fortune and hardship. They tell of creatures who thrived when the world offered abundance, and who learned patience when the light thinned. In this world of muted seasons, feathers were as much armor as ornament. Many of these dinosaurs carried soft down or primitive plumage, not for flight, but for warmth. Their bodies held onto heat the way a forest floor holds moisture. Imagine one crouched in the undergrowth, its feathers ruffling in the wind, breath steaming faintly in the cool air. Its eyes were wide, tuned to the faintest glint of motion. These were hunters of half-light, alert, cautious, perfectly evolved for the twilight that never ended. The rivers that wound through this landscape were alive with opportunity. Fish swam beneath drifting leaves, amphibians croaked in hidden pools, and insects hovered above the water in shimmering clouds. The small dinosaurs hunted along these edges, their clawed feet leaving impressions in the soft mud that would harden into stone. Some were solitary stalkers, moving in silence between tree trunks. Others hunted in loose groups, sharing kills, calling softly to one another in sounds the air no longer carries. They ate what they could: fish, small reptiles, carrion, even plants when the need arose. Survival in this land meant flexibility. The line between hunter and scavenger blurred beneath the polar sky. The forests themselves offered both shelter and challenge. In summer, the sun never set, and the world glowed in perpetual gold. Plants grew in fierce abundance, their leaves broad and soft from endless photosynthesis. The air hummed with insects, and prey was plentiful. But in the long twilight, color drained from the world. Shadows stretched endlessly, and sound replaced sight as the guide. The dinosaurs' senses adapted. Hearing sharp enough to catch the rustle of prey in the underbrush, smell keen enough to track through the dark. Some may have hibernated, curling beneath fallen logs or in shallow burrows, their bodies slowing to endure the months of dim cold. Others continued to move, feeding on roots or sleeping fish in half-frozen streams. They were not exiles in an alien world. They were specialists in its rhythm. Each generation refined the art of living where light and darkness refused to play by familiar rules. Fossilized footprints trace their paths across floodplains, small groups moving together, crossing shallow waters, pausing beneath trees that shed leaves only once every few years. In one site, the prints of a young dinosaur run alongside larger ones, perhaps a parent guiding its offspring through the gloom. Their world was demanding, but not barren. Life persisted, adapted, and carried on as if the strange dance of seasons were the most natural thing in the world. These polar dinosaurs were part of a larger web that spanned the globe. Relatives of theirs roamed in warmer lands, but the Antarctic species were tempered by challenge. They grew slower, lived longer, and perhaps thought differently, alert to small changes, to faint scents and distant echoes. In a way, they foreshadowed what would become the defining trait of survivors across Earth's history: adaptability. Today, the rocks that hold their bones lie buried under miles of ice, but the story they tell melts easily in the mind's eye. The image of a feathered hunter threading through dripping ferns under a sky of endless dusk feels intimate, almost familiar. It reminds us that life finds rhythm in chaos, that evolution is not a march toward power, but a conversation with environment. In the long twilight of ancient Antarctica, dinosaurs answered that conversation with grace. They became creatures of the in-between, neither day nor night, neither tropical nor frigid, thriving on the edge of extremes. When you think of dinosaurs, you might picture heat and sunlight, deserts and thunder. But listen closely to the stones of the far south, and you'll hear a different sound. The soft footfall of something light and careful, moving through fog, its breath warm against the cold air. A creature not of fire and fury, but of endurance and patience. In that endless dusk, where light faded but never died, the dinosaurs of Antarctica learned how to live with the world exactly as it was, half in shadow, wholly alive. Fire is not something we usually imagine in the cool, damp world of ancient Antarctica. Yet the rocks tell a different story. Between layers of calm river mud and fallen leaves, thin black seams of charcoal appear, silent witnesses to flames that once swept through the forests. Under a sky of long twilight and drifting clouds, lightning must have flashed, striking the resinous trunks of conifers or the dry litter that built up at the forest floor's edge. Sometimes it was volcanic sparks, other times a season of dryness, rare but enough. When the flames came, they moved quickly through the undergrowth, crackling against bark, licking at the canopy, painting the night red against the low horizon. The sound of such a fire would have been like a storm with no rain, a roaring that drowned out the river's murmur and drove the small creatures of the forest to shelter. Dinosaurs scattered through the ferns, insects rose in shimmering clouds, and amphibians slid into nearby streams to wait out the heat. Smoke filled the air, thick and pungent with the scent of sap and resin, rising into a sky that already hung low and dim. The flames did not burn for long. Humidity and patchy moisture held them in check. But even a short fire left behind devastation. Blackened trunks, ash settling like snow. Silence where the forest's hum had once been. Then came the next act, the one that defines life more than destruction ever could: renewal. Within days, perhaps weeks, a new color appeared on the gray landscape. Ferns, those ancient opportunists, pushed through the ash, their fronds uncurling like green smoke. They didn't need seeds carried by wind or animal. They rose directly from rhizomes hidden underground, untouched by the fire's reach. In the warm, damp soil enriched by minerals from the burn, they spread fast, covering the ground in a living carpet. The fern spike, as paleobotanists call it, marks these moments in the fossil record, a sudden abundance of fern spores after fire events, preserved in fine sediment like a fingerprint of recovery. To walk through such a fern prairie would have felt like stepping into a dream of rebirth. The air, once acrid, now smelled of wet soil and new growth. Sunlight poured down through the open canopy, reaching places that had been shaded for centuries. The charred remains of trees stood like monuments, black pillars among waves of green. Small reptiles and amphibians returned first, followed by insects, drawn to the warmth and the soft texture of the new leaves. Within a few years, young trees began to sprout, seedlings of conifers and seed ferns rising through the fern's dense mat. The forest, ever patient, began its slow march back. In the cycle of these forests, fire was not an intruder. It was a sculptor. It cleared space for diversity, opened habitats for creatures that thrived on edges and transitions. Each blaze reset the ecological clock, forcing competition and adaptation. Insects found fresh food sources. Small dinosaurs learned to forage in open sunlight. Amphibians took advantage of newly warmed pools. Even decay sped up. Charcoal fragments mixed with minerals and rainwater, feeding the soil that would nourish the next generation of plants. Fire, in its paradoxical way, made life richer. The fossil record preserves this rhythm like music in layers of stone. A sheet of charcoal followed by a layer thick with fern spores. Then, above it, new leaf impressions and tree roots. Burn, regrow, thrive, and burn again. The pattern repeats through millions of years. The evidence is delicate. A thin line of carbon, a single charred leaf fragment, or the ghostly imprint of a fern stem pressed into shale. But taken together, these clues reveal a landscape in motion, pulsing between loss and abundance, always circling back to green. It's humbling to realize that even here, at the farthest reaches of the earth, fire found a foothold. Warmth did not mean safety. It meant volatility. The same climate that nurtured vast forests also allowed sparks to catch, feeding the flames that would test their resilience. And resilience, in this ancient land, came clothed in many forms, but none more graceful than the fern. When the giants fell and the canopy opened, it was the ferns that claimed the empty light. Their spores drifted like dust, settling over ash, promising return. In the present, when scientists split rock and find these black bands and fern-rich layers, they can almost read the story in sequence. The heat, the silence, the first shoots. Each charcoal fleck is both a scar and a seed. It speaks of how life on Earth has always danced with disaster, using destruction as a bridge to renewal. Fire, for all its fury, is one of the planet's oldest teachers. It teaches impermanence, patience, and rebirth. And so, the fern prairies of ancient Antarctica remind us that resilience is not loud. It is quiet and steady. It unfurls leaf by leaf through ash, turning what was lost into what will live again. Deep beneath the ice, where silence presses against stone, lie seams of coal, black ribbons of ancient sunlight. Each layer is the residue of a world that once thrived with warmth and green abundance. a time when the sun lingered for months and darkness was only a pause between seasons. The coal of Antarctica is not just carbon. It is the condensed memory of forests, rivers, and rains, captured in the chemistry of time. Every lump is a story told in heat and shadow, the echo of a summer that never truly ended. To understand how such a thing was made, you must return to that vanished world. Picture a swampy plain at the edge of a slow-moving river, thick with trees of glossopteris and ferns taller than a man. The air is warm, humid, and fragrant with decay. Beneath the canopy, the forest floor is a living sponge of waterlogged soil and fallen leaves. Branches snap softly underfoot, releasing the scent of resin and earth. Rain drips endlessly from moss-draped trunks, pooling in low hollows where roots twist through black mud. Here, life grows faster than death can consume it. Every leaf that falls becomes part of a rising tide of organic matter. Year after year, century after century, the swamp deepens, not upward in branches, but downward in sediment. This is how coal begins, not with fire, but with stillness. Dead plants sink into oxygen-poor water, where decay slows to a crawl. Instead of disappearing, they accumulate. Layers of peat form, thick, dark, and soft as sponge cake. The surface is alive with new growth, while the bottom sinks into shadow, pressed and preserved. As the continent drifts and the climate shifts, new sediments wash over these peatlands, sealing them off from air. The weight of rock, the slow heat of the Earth's crust, and the patient chemistry of time transform the peat into something new. The soft mats harden into coal, petrified sunlight, stored in the deep. Geologists can read those seams like chapters in a book. The thickness of a layer tells how long a forest stood before burial. The ash content reveals how much volcanic dust or flood sediment mingled with the plant matter. The types of organic fragments, mexerals, speak of the plants themselves. The tough bark of conifers, the waxy cuticles of leaves, the delicate remains of ferns. Together, these details form a vivid map of ancient wetlands that once stretched across the southern supercontinent. When you hold a piece of coal from Antarctica, you are holding a cross-section of deep time, a tangible moment when warmth reached the poles and forests thrived beneath a never-setting sun. But coal is more than evidence. It is paradox. It is both life and death, creation and destruction, the quiet balance between growth and decay. When we burn it, we reverse time's long work. The carbon that was locked away in the deep for hundreds of millions of years returns to the air in an instant, joining the atmosphere once more as invisible gas. The heat it releases is the same sunlight those ancient plants captured, the same energy that made them grow. Coal is the night-blooming sun, the fossilized radiance of the world reborn in flame. There is a haunting symmetry in that. The very fuel that powers our modern civilization is drawn from a greenhouse world that once blanketed the poles and forests. We burn those ancient summers now, and the atmosphere grows heavy again, the planet warmer. In a sense, we are resurrecting the climate that gave birth to the coal in the first place, a strange mirror between past and present. The earth remembers, and it repeats. Still, to see coal only as a warning would be to miss its deeper meaning. It is also a record of endurance. Every seam beneath Antarctica's ice is a testament to how life adapts, how it thrives in unlikely places, how it finds balance even at the planet's extremes. Those forests did not fear the long nights or the shallow light. They turned scarcity into rhythm, darkness into opportunity. The coal they left behind is proof that abundance once lived where cold now reigns. That the planet's capacity for renewal has always been written into its bones. If you stand on the ice today and imagine the heat stored far below, you can almost feel it. Faint, patient, waiting. The warmth of long-vanished suns, trapped in layers of black stone, whispering of a world that was and might be again. Coal is not merely rock, it is a memory, a mirror, a promise, and a warning. It tells us that light, once given to the earth, never truly disappears. It only changes form, cycling through forests and fossils, through time and fire, forever finding its way back into the sky. If you were to walk through the exposed rock beds of Antarctica today, the ice and wind might part just long enough to reveal something extraordinary. Stumps still rooted where they grew, their rings frozen in time. These are not fossils in the usual sense of bones or shells. They are pieces of a forest's heart, its memory etched in circles of wood, each one a whisper from a season long gone. To look at a polished cross-section of that ancient timber is to hold a pulse, stilled but still speaking. The rings are fine and close together, dark and light alternating like breaths, wide when the world was generous, narrow when it was not. The trees that grew here were survivors of a difficult rhythm. They lived in a place where the sun's favor was not constant, where months of endless daylight gave way to months of half-darkness. But these were not the rhythms of cold and heat as we know them now. They were the rhythms of light and shadow, of growing and waiting. Unlike modern trees that rest in winter's freeze, these ancient trunks tell us their lives slowed but rarely stopped. Even when the sun circled low or dipped away for weeks, their cells continued to divide. Their roots continued to sip from the damp soil beneath the snowless ground. Life here was never frozen. It merely moved at a slower tempo. When scientists examine these fossilized trunks, they see that each ring carries more than a measure of time. It carries information about the air and the earth. Wide rings mean long seasons of sunlight and abundant rain. Narrow rings suggest droughts or volcanic haze that dim the sky. Within each ring are isotopic signatures, tiny chemical echoes of the atmosphere that fed the tree that year. Carbon ratios reveal how much greenhouse gas filled the air. Oxygen isotopes whisper of rainfall and temperature. Together, they form a coded record of an environment that breathed, shifted, and evolved over millions of years. The wood becomes a diary of climate, each page written in cellulose and silence. Some trunks, when polished, still gleam with a faint luster, the ghost of their former life preserved in stone. Hold one to the light, and you can see the patterns ripple like water, each line wrapping around the next in perfect continuity. It's easy to imagine the years unfolding. A bright summer when leaves drank deeply from rivers that never froze. A muted dusk when roots reached further for moisture. A mild storm that pruned the weak and fed the soil. Each layer marks survival, not just existence. In places, entire forests have been fossilized where they once stood. Stumps, still anchored in ancient soil, rise from sediment layers, their roots spreading outward like frozen hands. Some lie fallen, their trunks aligned in the same direction, as though a single storm once felled them. These forests, turned to stone, are so well preserved that you can trace the grain, the knots, even the texture of bark. They are monuments to resilience, proof that life flourished here for tens of millions of years before ice carved the land bare. It's humbling to realize that these trees never saw true winter. The darkness came, yes, but not the killing frost. Their dormancy was a kind of meditation, not sleep. When the light returned, they resumed growth seamlessly, as if the world had merely blinked. That continuity is written in their anatomy. Growth rings that do not stop abruptly, but gently fade and brighten again. They learn to translate twilight into time, to let patience stand in for sunlight. Sometimes, when a slice of fossil wood is examined under magnification, tiny pockets of ancient atmosphere are found trapped inside quartz crystals that replace the organic tissue. Those microbubbles, sealed since the Triassic or Permian, hold molecules of air older than any ice core. Inside them are hints of a sky thick with carbon dioxide and moisture, the breath of a greenhouse Earth. In a way, each fossil tree is both root and relic, connecting us directly to the air it once inhaled. There's a strange tenderness in that. We often think of fossils as hard, lifeless things, but these stones still carry a pulse. The rings spiral outward in an unbroken memory of growth and adaptation, their patterns as intricate as fingerprints. They remind us that even at the edge of the world, where light fails for half the year, life found a rhythm. The trees did not resist their environment. They negotiated with it. They learned when to pause, when to reach, when to let the sky do what it would. To trace those rings with your finger is to feel time itself, layered, compressed, and perfectly preserved. You're touching the record of a forest that once breathed under stars that never set. A forest that knew how to live with darkness and light in equal measure. The rings whisper softly that patience is strength, that endurance can be beautiful, and that even in the quietest corners of the planet, the story of life is written in circles, endless, delicate, and true. The warmth that once cradled Antarctica was no mystery of magic or myth. It was the sky itself, heavier and thicker than the one we know today. The air wrapped around the planet like a deep quilt, trapping the sun's energy and spreading it evenly from equator to pole. It was a world running on greenhouse breath, where carbon dioxide and water vapor mingled in abundance, weaving a veil that softened the extremes of day and night. The ice caps of our imagination did not yet exist. In their place were clouds and rain, thunder and mist, warmth that pooled instead of fled. High above, volcanic plumes traced slow spirals into the atmosphere. They rose from the fractures of a restless planet, where Gondwana still strained against its seams. Eruptions spewed ash and gases, sulfur and carbon, each with its own rhythm. For short spans, ash cooled the surface, scattering sunlight and dimming the world to a brown twilight. But the carbon lingered, invisible and potent, thickening the air and turning the planet into a cradle of heat. It was not an even warmth. There were floods and droughts, years when clouds vanished, and others when rain fell for months. But frost was rare, and the rivers never froze. Ocean currents completed the pattern. In that ancient geography, there was no ring of icy water circling the pole to keep it cold. Instead, the seas moved freely between continents, carrying heat from tropical shallows to southern shores. Warm tides licked at Antarctic beaches, turning them into corridors of green. Coral reefs may have flourished in the nearby seas, and plankton blooms fed the food chain that spilled into estuaries. The ocean's breath was the planet's heartbeat, and at this time, that beat was strong, steady, and warm. Rain was not the enemy here. It was the architect. Moisture evaporated easily under the greenhouse sky, rising in thick mists that built towering clouds. Storms rolled across the supercontinent, sometimes gentle, sometimes furious. When they passed, they left behind rivers swollen with life. Forests drank deeply, and the soil, always damp, became an engine of fertility. Fungi and bacteria decomposed fallen leaves into nourishment, cycling carbon back into the air and water, closing the loop that kept the world alive. The air would have smelled of growth, wet wood, sap, moss, and the faint sweetness of decay. Under this humid dome, biodiversity bloomed. Plants that today seem fragile thrived near the pole, building layered ecosystems of towering conifers, ground ferns, and creeping mosses. Insects multiplied, pollinators and scavengers filling every niche between root and canopy. Amphibians and reptiles ruled the rivers, and small dinosaurs moved like whispers through the trees. Warmth made energy abundant, and abundance allowed experimentation. Evolution thrives not in stability, but in opportunity. And the greenhouse sky was generous. Yet this was not a paradise without consequence. The same processes that made the planet lush also made it volatile. When carbon levels rose too high, rain patterns shifted. When volcanoes raged, they shadowed the sun. When continents moved, they reshaped the flow of the seas. The earth has always been both painter and destroyer, creating beauty in one stroke and erasing it in the next. In the layers of sediment, we can still see those oscillations. Thin clay bands marking volcanic winters, thick, dark layers showing floods of organic life that followed. Each represents a breath in the planet's slow conversation with itself. If you could stand in that world and look upward, the sky would appear denser, more golden. The sunlight filtered through a curtain of haze. The stars at night would shimmer dimly behind a veil of moisture, their light diffused rather than sharp. The air would feel heavy on your skin, thick with humidity. The horizon, a constant shimmer of heat and vapor. Every sound, the call of a distant animal, the hiss of rain on leaves, would seem softened, muffled by the weight of atmosphere. Scientists call these times greenhouse intervals, but that phrase feels too technical for something so alive. The world was not trapped under glass, it was blooming under a grand planetary breath. Carbon, water, sunlight, and life were all participants in a complex dance, each influencing the other in a feedback of endless motion. The balance was delicate, but for millions of years it held. The warmth that allowed crocodiles to bask near the pole and forests to flourish under midnight suns was the same warmth that now lies buried in coal seams, in oil shales, in the very rocks that tell their story. The greenhouse sky reminds us that climate is not a switch to be flipped, but a song composed of countless instruments, volcanoes, oceans, sunlight, carbon, and the stubborn persistence of life. When the tempo rises, forests grow taller, rivers run stronger, and the planet hums with creation. But if the melody surges too far, the same warmth that sustains can also transform, turning balance into chaos. In those faraway ages, the earth sang loudly, and Antarctica was one of its brightest notes. The air shimmered, the rain fell warm, and every root, leaf, and creature played its part in the great orchestra of heat. It was a time when the world itself seemed to breathe in harmony. A living, glowing sphere beneath a greenhouse sky, in the world that once existed at the bottom of the earth. Light and warmth were not the same thing. The sun could shine for months, circling low on the horizon, yet its rays felt soft, diffuse, more glow than blaze. And when it finally slipped away, the darkness that followed was never total, only a dim twilight that lingered like an afterimage. Antarctica, in those long-lost ages, lived in a world of light without heat and heat without light, a rhythm foreign to modern imagination, but perfectly ordinary to the creatures that called it home. For the plants, the endless summer light was both a gift and a challenge. Without true night, their clocks had to rely on faint cues. The angle of the sun, the subtle shifts in color as daylight stretched and bent around the world's curve. Trees did not count days. They measured glow. Some grew steadily through the long season, their cells dividing in unbroken rhythm. Others pulsed, adjusting their pace to match the waxing and waning of intensity. When the months of twilight came, they slowed but did not sleep. Their leaves grew waxy and dark, conserving moisture, their roots drawing on stored sugars to outlast the muted sun. In these forests, every organism learned patience. Growth came not from racing toward warmth, but from enduring its absence gracefully. The soil was never frozen, but it cooled. The air dimmed. Rain became drizzle, then mist. Insects retreated into bark crevices, waiting for the brighter glow to return. Amphibians sank into mud or found safety in the hollow bases of fallen trees, slowing their hearts until the world brightened again. Reptiles basked when they could, and huddled together when they could not. The forest floor would have seemed quiet during those twilight months. Yet beneath the stillness, life remained. Every heartbeat, every slow breath was a calculation of waiting. Animals here didn't measure survival by temperature, but by light itself. The signal to feed, to mate, to migrate wasn't a change in degrees, but a shift in hue. The way twilight leaned from gold to gray, or how the first thin shadows reappeared after the endless day. Fish in rivers timed their spawning to pulses of runoff when the snowmelt upstream, what little there was, swelled the water. Insects emerged not by calendar, but by rhythm of brightness. It was a choreography of subtlety, an entire biosphere dancing to light's long gradients instead of heat cycles. Imagine a world where there is no sunrise, only a slow brightening, and no sunset, only a long fade. Days do not end. They stretch until they lose meaning. Nights do not fall. They accumulate like a slow exhale. Life in such a place cannot rely on instinct alone. It must invent new instincts, built from memory and flexibility. To be a creature under these skies was to live by feel, not clock, to sense the faintest shift of color in the canopy, to read the way air changed texture when the sun tilted just slightly lower. In this strange rhythm, behaviors emerged that would seem almost alien now. Some small dinosaurs may have grown semi-nocturnal, their vision tuned to dim light. Others likely hunted by scent or vibration, their senses compensating for the drawn-out dusk. Plants, too, adapted. Evergreen species developed pigments that absorbed even the weakest light, their leaves acting like slow solar batteries. Deciduous forms dropped their leaves not to escape frost, but to reduce respiration when photosynthesis became inefficient. The entire ecosystem functioned like a vast breathing organism, inhaling energy through summer's endless day and exhaling it through winter's long sigh. To live here was to master endurance. It required not strength, but rhythm, not resistance, but fluency with the tempo of twilight. The creatures of this place did not fight their environment. They became part of its pulse. Their biology blurred the line between day and night, between wakefulness and dormancy. They existed in a state of dynamic balance, poised between abundance and restraint. Today, when we look at modern polar life, penguins huddling through storms, seals sleeping under ice, mosses surviving on droplets, we see adaptations to cold. But in that ancient age, the adaptations were to light itself. The problem was not freezing, but seeing, not surviving winter's cold, but winter's dimness. Life solved it not with fur or fat, but with timing and patience, with inner clocks that could stretch and bend without breaking. If you stood in that world and lifted your eyes, you would see a sky that never truly darkened, painted in shades of indigo and rose. The air would hum with quiet persistence. The drip of water, the whisper of insects, the low call of unseen animals moving through the half-light. It would feel dreamlike, a place caught between waking and sleep. And yet, for millions of years, it was home. A living world that thrived in the balance between too much light and too little warmth. Light without heat. Heat without light. It sounds like contradiction, but to the forests and rivers of ancient Antarctica, it was harmony. It was the rhythm of a planet that knew how to make life flourish, not in comfort, but in compromise. The Earth's heartbeat is not measured in seconds, but in eruptions. Deep beneath the forests and rivers of ancient Antarctica, molten rock gathered in chambers, rising with pressure until the crust fractured and the world above shuddered. The ground swelled, split, and bled light. Lava poured in sheets across valleys, hissing as it met the damp earth. Ash rose into the atmosphere, turning daylight into a copper dusk. And then, as suddenly as it began, silence. The land cooled, steam curled upward, and the planet took a slow, smoky breath. This was the rhythm of deep time, the volcanic metronome keeping measure beneath the green song of life. Each eruption was both destruction and renewal. The forests that had spread across the ancient supercontinent found themselves periodically erased by a fine gray blanket of ash. Leaves curled and fell. Ferns blackened. Rivers turned opaque with sediment, their channels clogged with silt. Yet within months or years, life returned. Ash carried minerals, potassium, phosphorus, calcium, that leached into the soil with rain, recharging it like a battery. Where death fell, fertility followed. New shoots sprouted in the ashen ground, feasting on the fresh nutrients. Forests rebounded in waves, thicker and more diverse than before. But these pulses of fire and ash did more than shape the landscape. They tuned the climate. Each eruption sent a rush of aerosols into the stratosphere, tiny reflective particles that dimmed sunlight. For a few years, the world cooled. Temperatures dipped, rains shifted. The once humid air grew momentarily crisp. But the effect was fleeting. The real transformation came from the invisible gases, carbon dioxide and methane, that seeped from the lava fields and vents long after the skies cleared. Those gases lingered for centuries, thickening the air, trapping more heat. It was as if the planet exhaled warmth in installments, one eruption at a time, adding another beat to the slow, rising tempo of the greenhouse world. In the geological record, those beats are still visible. Geologists can read them in stripes of black and red, in basalt flows that cool into hexagonal columns, in layers of volcanic ash pressed thin between coal seams. Each layer is a measure of time, a pulse preserved in rock. Some flows stretch across continents, remnants of massive volcanic provinces that once spanned the southern hemisphere. These were no small outbursts. They were planetary events, vast floods of lava that darkened skies and shifted ecosystems across the globe. In the swamps of ancient Antarctica, these eruptions rewrote the story of life again and again. After each ashfall, ferns would rise first, their spores spreading rapidly over the barren ground. Behind them came the trees, conifers, cycads, and glossopteris, their roots pushing through cooling layers of gray. The rivers, choked at first with debris, eventually carried the volcanic minerals downstream, feeding algal blooms in distant seas. Plankton flourished, consuming nutrients until oxygen levels dropped, suffocating deeper waters. The pattern repeated with each cycle of eruption and recovery. Each pulse a reminder that creation and destruction are twin forces in the planet's song. Imagine standing in that ancient forest as the first tremors begin. The air smells of resin and damp soil. Birds and reptiles fall silent. The ground quivers underfoot. Then, from the horizon, a glow, the kind of red that turns clouds into mirrors. Hours later, ash begins to fall, soft as snow but warm to the touch. It coats leaves, fills footprints, settles in water. For days, the world grows dim. Rivers run gray. The sun becomes a blurred halo. And when it finally clears, everything looks remade. Familiar, yet alien. New landscapes emerge from the ashes, shaped by heat and healed by time. These volcanic rhythms were the planet's punctuation marks, interruptions in the long story of warmth and life. Without them, the Earth might have drifted toward monotony, a steady climate with little innovation. But with them came variation. Cooler spells that tested endurance, warmer intervals that expanded ecosystems, sudden nutrient bursts that spurred evolution. Each eruption pressed the reset button, forcing life to adapt, rebuild, and diversify. Even now, Antarctica bears the scars of that fiery past. Beneath its ice lie mountains of basalt, sills of frozen magma, and seams of ash locked within ancient sediments. To look at them is to hear the faint ticking of that planetary metronome, a rhythm that never truly stopped, only slowed beneath the frost. Volcanism was the drummer of deep time, keeping the world in tempo while continents drifted, climates breathed, and species rose and fell in time with the beat. The forests that once thrived under the greenhouse sky lived according to this cadence, their roots pushing through ashes that had cooled just enough to hold life again. They grew in the pauses between eruptions, and when fire returned, they began again. In this way, the Earth wrote its music, loud and slow, destructive yet creative, relentless but never chaotic. The volcanic metronome didn't compose the melody of life on its own, but without its pulse, there would have been no rhythm at all. Long before the ice arrived, the oceans around Antarctica were warm, restless, and alive. There was no cold girdle swirling around the pole, no Antarctic circumpolar current to lock the continent in isolation. Instead, the seas were open highways of heat. Water that began its journey in the tropics could drift south without resistance, carrying warmth and nutrients straight to the polar shores. The coastline was not an edge of frozen cliffs, but a tapestry of deltas, reefs, and lagoons. Waves lapped against fern-covered river mouths, and estuaries teemed with life, their tides pulsing through forests of roots and green shadow. In this world, Antarctica was not separate, but connected. Its marine ecosystems linked seamlessly with those of the larger supercontinent. Fish, ammonites, and marine reptiles swam freely across these boundaries, following the gentle gradients of temperature and light. The seas glowed with plankton blooms, green and gold, feeding layers upon layers of life. Above them, reptilian predators like plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs cut through the waves, sleek as dolphins, but armed with teeth honed for the chase. In shallower bays, mollusks clung to rocks, while corals built small reefs that broke the surf into whispering foam. The water was clear and temperate, rich enough to support an entire web of creatures, from microscopic algae to leviathan hunters. The climate harmony of that age depended on connection. With no polar barrier, the ocean's warmth spread like a shared breath across hemispheres. Each current was a ribbon in a vast tapestry of movement, carrying energy and moisture, distributing balance between equator and pole. Antarctica's position at the southern hinge of this system made it a crossroads of global exchange. Monsoons from the north brought sediment and nutrients, while southern gyres carried oxygen-rich waters into the deep. The rhythm of tides and temperature shaped everything from the growth of forests to the thickness of shells on the seafloor. And yet, even in this seeming stability, slow changes were underway. Deep in the planet's mantle, plates continued their silent migration. Antarctica began to drift southward inch by inch. To its west, the land that would become South America pulled away. To its east, Australia started to slip northward, breaking the bonds that had tethered the continents together for so long. As these land bridges tore, the pathways of the ocean changed. Channels widened, basins deepened, and new circulation patterns began to stir in the global sea. It was not sudden. Nothing in geology is. But the consequences were profound. As the gap between Antarctica and South America opened, a corridor was born. The Drake Passage, a narrow strait that would become one of the most powerful conduits on Earth. Through it, the winds of the Southern Ocean began to drive a continuous current around the continent. This was the birth of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, the great spinning moat of cold water that would one day encircle Antarctica completely. Once it strengthened, it became a thermal wall, preventing warm tropical waters from reaching the pole. The ocean that had once delivered life-giving heat became a guardian of cold. The transformation took millions of years, but its impact was total. As the new current accelerated, the air above it cooled. Storms shifted. Glaciers began to form on the highest peaks, their edges creeping slowly downward. Coral reefs vanished from the coastlines. Mangrove forests gave way to tundra mosses, which in turn gave way to barren stone. The marine reptiles that had once hunted in the warm shallows disappeared, their prey gone, their habitats drowned beneath the rising chill. Shell beds, once dense with life, fell silent and were buried in sediment. When the polar fence was finally complete, Antarctica stood alone. The same ocean that had once carried warmth now trapped the cold, spinning endlessly around the continent in an unbroken loop. Heat from the rest of the world could no longer reach its shores. The change did not just alter one landmass, it rewrote the planet's climate system. The formation of the circumpolar current cooled the southern hemisphere, lowered sea levels, and even influenced atmospheric circulation patterns far to the north. It was a tipping point in Earth's story, the moment when the blue planet's balance shifted toward the frozen. If you could dive beneath those ancient waves before the curtain of cold descended, you would see a world of astonishing color. Beds of shells shimmer beneath clear water, crabs scuttle between corals, and sleek reptiles glide through sunlit currents. The ocean would feel warm to the touch, its surface rippling with the reflections of fern-covered cliffs. Yet somewhere beneath that beauty, the tectonic engine was already preparing the next act, shaping a future of snow and silence. The oceans once fed Antarctica, connected it, and kept it alive. But when the currents changed, they turned protector of the cold, isolating the continent from the warmth it once knew. The reefs fossilized, the beaches froze, and where waves once carried life to the shore, they now crash against ice shelves, repeating the same rhythm in reverse. The oceans had not abandoned Antarctica. They had simply changed their song, from the lullaby of life to the hymn of ice. To understand the world that once was, we must learn to read what the earth has written. Rocks are not silent. They speak in layers, in textures, in colors that shift like the tones of memory. The story of ancient Antarctica lies not in myth or imagination, but in the language of strata. Sentences of sandstone and shale, paragraphs of coal, entire chapters of mudstone pressed beneath the weight of vanished forests and long, quiet rivers. These pages are fragile, but they endure. When wind strips away the ice and snow, the cliffs open like books in a library older than life itself. Each layer tells a piece of the tale. The thick sandstones are the rush of ancient rivers, their grains rounded smooth from miles of travel. You can trace the angle of crossbeds like the slant of handwriting, showing which way the current once flowed. Ripple marks, delicate as fingerprints, dot the surfaces of finer sediments, frozen waves that once danced in shallow water. Shales form in the calm that follows, the slow settling of silt in still pools or wide floodplains. Then, between them, come the coal seams, dark lines that mark the breath of the forest, the places where life paused to grow thick and heavy before being buried again. Geologists read these textures the way linguists read old manuscripts. A tilt here means the river changed course. A fine-grained layer means the flood slowed. An abrupt boundary, sharp and uneven, records a storm, a fire, or a drought that reset the landscape. Paleosols, the fossilized remains of ancient soils, are the punctuation marks of the planet. A comma for a pause in sedimentation, a semicolon for transition, a period for stillness before new beginning. The Earth's writing is patient, deliberate, and honest. It keeps everything, even its mistakes. When scientists compare these strata across Antarctica and beyond, they find astonishing connections. An ash bed in one valley matches perfectly with a thin, glassy layer half a continent away. The fingerprint of a single volcanic eruption. These layers are the page numbers that let us align distant stories, confirming that what happened in one basin also echoed in another. With them, we can reconstruct entire landscapes. Where rivers braided into deltas, where lakes expanded and dried, where forests stood long enough to leave behind their roots. Each comparison turns chaos into chronology, chance into narrative. Standing before these rocks is like stepping into time made visible. The colors tell their own part of the story. Iron-rich reds from oxygenated floods, olive greens from waterlogged swamps, pale grays where ash settled over calm plains. In the dim Antarctic light, those hues seem almost to breathe. The reds deepening when the sun strikes them, the blacks of the coal seams absorbing the glow like trapped heat. To trace your hand along a cliff face is to move across millions of years in inches, to feel the rough transition from sand to silt to peat, to understand that each layer once touched open air and light. The process of translating these rocks is slow work, and yet, through it, we hear the voice of a planet remembering itself. Chemical tests reveal the ratio of elements, allowing scientists to measure the oxygen in the ancient atmosphere or the temperature of long-vanished seas. Microscopic analysis uncovers spores, grains of pollen, and fragments of carbonized wood, tiny witnesses that speak of ferns, trees, and seasons. Each discovery adds a word, a phrase, to the sentence of the past. When read together, they tell a story not of catastrophe, but of continuity. Water moving, life returning, time pressing down. In Antarctica, this record is unusually clean. The ice acts like a glass dome, preserving and protecting the outcrops from vegetation and erosion. When the wind scours away the surface, it reveals the strata in crisp detail. To walk among these cliffs is to wander through an open archive, where every outcrop is a page, every fossil a note in the margin. The cold air stings, but the rocks are alive with warmth. The warmth of process, of change, of memory held close. It's tempting to romanticize these layers as relics of a lost paradise, but what they really show is motion. The Earth has always been in motion. The rivers that carved those sandstones flowed under skies thick with clouds. The plants that became coal grew in low light, drinking from soils that felt the breath of volcanic ash. The muds that settled into shale were stirred by insects, raindrops, and the roots of trees. Every layer is the result of movement slowed to stillness, of chaos condensed into form. When you stand before these ancient rocks and let your eyes trace the bands from bottom to top, you are reading not just geology, but persistence. You are seeing how time accumulates, how life and death are pressed together until they become indistinguishable. The cliffs of Antarctica are not barren. They are eloquent. Their language may be technical, their grammar complex, but their meaning is simple and deeply human. That even in a world of constant change, stories endure. Beneath the ice, beneath the weight of ages, the earth has kept its record. And when we finally learn to read it, we find that summer still sleeps inside the stone. Hidden inside the rocks and fossils of Antarctica are whispers far smaller than any leaf or bone. Atoms that remember the weather. Locked in the lattice of minerals, sealed within tooth enamel or carbonate shells, these atoms carry tiny variations called isotopes, different flavors of the same element. Oxygen and carbon, the twin storytellers of climate, serve as nature's most patient record keepers. Their ratios are the planet's old diary entries, written not in ink, but in mass and proportion. They do not fade. They wait. And when we learn to read them, they tell us what the air once felt like on the skin of the earth. Each isotope acts as a subtle thermometer, sensitive to the world it was born into. When a raindrop falls from a warm sky, its oxygen atoms lean toward the lighter variety, oxygen 16, because heat gives them the energy to escape from the sea and rise into clouds. In colder times, more of the heavier oxygen 18 remains trapped in the oceans. When that water later forms shells or limestone, the isotopic balance within the rock carries a precise signature of its birth climate. A simple chemical measurement becomes a time machine, translating numbers into sensation. A mild drizzle on fern leaves, a humid afternoon above a swamp. The breath of a river delta under a long, dim sun. Carbon tells another part of the story. Plants, in their endless dialogue with air, choose carbon isotopes differently depending on how they live. Some prefer the lighter carbon-12, others incorporate more carbon-13, and these choices shift with temperature, humidity, and light. When those plants decay or fossilize, their isotopic fingerprints remain. Even in coal, blackened sunlight trapped underground, we can still detect the echoes of the forest's metabolism. How efficiently it drew carbon from the air, how much moisture fed its roots, how much warmth wrapped its canopy. Through these ratios, scientists can reconstruct the invisible, photosynthesis, rainfall, the breath of leaves from millions of years ago. In Antarctica's rocks from its green eras, these isotopic records tell a consistent tale. The oxygen values speak of water that was liquid year-round, of seas that rarely froze, of air moist enough to nourish steady rain. Carbon isotopes from plant matter hint at lush vegetation thriving under long days, where light rather than heat governed growth. Seasonal swings appear muted, as if the oceans themselves acted like a steadying hand, softening the extremes of temperature. The numbers suggest a world of mild summers and gentle winters, a temperate polar realm, improbable by today's standards, but clear in the chemistry. It is easy to romanticize this, but the data are precise, almost clinical. A few parts per thousand difference in isotope ratios, and the story changes from tropical humidity to cool temperate drizzle. The tools of measurement are delicate, mass spectrometers that can separate atoms by infinitesimal differences in weight. Inside their vacuum chambers, samples from ancient shells or fossilized wood are vaporized, their molecules broken apart and weighed like snowflakes on a cosmic scale. The results are plotted on graphs, points forming lines, lines forming patterns. And from those patterns, scientists can draw temperature curves, rainfall cycles, even the rhythm of the seasons as they played out in a world that no longer exists. But there is poetry hidden in the precision. These isotopes are not abstract data. They are memories of real moments. Every molecule of oxygen inside a shell once drifted in a raindrop that fell onto an ancient sea. Every atom of carbon in a coal seam once sat inside a living leaf, vibrating in sunlight under a sky without ice. They are tiny relics of breath and storm, of evaporation and condensation, of time moving in liquid form. When we analyze them, we are eavesdropping on the conversations between air, water, and life that once defined the planet's pulse. In this way, the Antarctic rocks become more than archives of stone. They become climate diaries with atomic handwriting. The isotopes whisper details we could never infer from fossils alone. They tell us not only that the continent was green, but how it felt to live there. The humidity that softened the air, the steadiness of temperature, the rhythm of rainfall that fed the rivers. They transformed geology into meteorology, allowing us to reconstruct not just epochs, but afternoons. And in their quiet precision lies something humbling. While ice sheets have erased forests and fossils have lost their color, the isotopes endure, unchanged. They survived burial, metamorphosis, and eons of silence. They are the Earth's most faithful witnesses, carrying the memory of warmth through the coldest ages. If you hold a piece of fossilized shell or petrified wood from Antarctica and could somehow listen closely enough, you might hear it still. The faint echo of rain falling on ancient leaves, the sigh of steam rising from a warm sea under a sun that never set. The isotopes remember, even when everything else forgets. If the stones of Antarctica are its pages, then pollen and spores are the handwriting. Delicate, countless, and impossibly small. To the naked eye, they are specks of dust caught in mud. But under the microscope, they become tiny sculptures, each one a masterpiece of function and form. Spheres armored with spikes, ovals etched with ridges, grains shaped like stars. Each species writes its name differently. Ferns leave spores like fine grains of sand. Conifers leave pollen with air sacs, miniature balloons built to drift. Together, they form an airborne diary, carried by wind and water across a continent that once pulsed with green. Palynology, the study of these grains, turns mud into memory. A teaspoon of sediment can hold tens of thousands of microfossils, a census of every plant that shed into the air that year. Unlike bones or wood, they travel far and endure well, settling into ponds, lakes, and floodplains where they are buried and preserved for millions of years. When the mud hardens into rock, the pollen remains, sealed in darkness. To free it, scientists dissolve the surrounding minerals with careful chemistry, leaving behind a constellation of shapes that glow under magnification. What seems like dust becomes data, a time lapse of entire ecosystems captured one grain at a time. In the samples drawn from Antarctic cores and outcrops, the patterns are mesmerizing. Wet-loving species surge after floods or fires, when ash and sediment open new ground for colonization. Fern spores spike dramatically in layers that mark volcanic activity. A fern spike, the planet's natural signature of renewal. Later, conifer pollen dominates, marking the return of mature forests, the rebuilding of canopies that once shaded amphibians and dinosaurs alike. Each rise and fall tells of disturbance and recovery, of forests breathing through cycles of chaos and calm. In some intervals, Drought-tolerant forms briefly appear, plants that thrived in cooler or drier conditions. Their fleeting reigns preserved like short, sharp notes in the symphony of time. To trace these shifts through layers is to watch a movie that has been slowed to the pace of geology. A flood sweeps through, scouring the lowlands, its sediment thick with spores from ferns and club mosses. Years pass, and the ferns give way to seed-bearing plants, their pollen floating like golden dust. Then a volcanic cloud darkens the sky, ash settles, and once again the ferns return to paint the land green. Each layer of mud, each faint horizon of clay, holds a new frame of the film. Read in sequence, the story becomes fluid. Canopy opens, understory races, pioneers retreat, long-lived elders return. The forest does not die and regrow. It exhales and inhales across millennia. Even the direction of the wind can be inferred from these tiny grains. Some pollen types appear hundreds of kilometers from where those plants could have grown, carried aloft by high-altitude currents. Others cluster in valleys, trapped by the calm of still air. By counting their relative abundance, researchers can reconstruct not just vegetation, but geography. Where rivers pooled, where mountains rose, where the breezes of summer carried their invisible cargo. The pollen grains are so light, they seem weightless. Yet together, they map the planet's breath. In Antarctica's warmer past, these airborne diaries confirm what the rocks and isotopes have already whispered, that the continent was once humid, fertile, alive. The diversity of pollen suggests forests dense with conifers and seed ferns, interlaced with patches of open wetlands. Spore-bearing plants thrived in the damp shade, while flowering plants began to edge their way into the mix during later intervals, their pollen showing up like quiet intruders from a more modern world. Each layer of sediment tells of adjustment, plants shifting their dominance in response to light, heat, moisture, and the slow turning of continents. To peer at these fossils through a microscope is to enter a space between intimacy and immensity. Each grain is smaller than a human hair, yet each carries information about entire ecosystems. The texture of their walls, the pattern of their pores, the way their numbers rise and fall, all translate into landscapes of the past. You can almost smell the damp soil, hear the faint patter of rain on leaves that no longer exist. Palynology makes the ancient tangible. It lets us see the invisible, how forests breathed, how climates shifted, how life responded not with panic, but with patience. And the beauty of it lies in their persistence. Fire can destroy trunks, floods can scour roots, glaciers can erase valleys. But pollen endures. It drifts across time like the planet's most reliable witness, settling quietly into layers where it waits to be found. A smear of clay becomes a forest's attendance sheet. A grain of dust becomes a voice from a vanished world. In every microscope slide pulled from Antarctic mud, the past blooms again in miniature. The forest rises, burns, and returns. The light changes, the species change with it. And when the wind stirs across the ice today, carrying nothing but frost, it still echoes those ancient breezes that once lifted clouds of living dust into the sky. The air itself remembers. When the sun began its slow disappearance and the forest dimmed into months of twilight, Antarctica's dinosaurs did not retreat into panic or torpor. They adapted. Their world was not one of deep freeze, but of long shadows. Light stretched thin, warmth diffused, color muted. They were creatures that lived by feel more than by sight, guided by the quiet senses that outlasted the sun. If you stood among them, you might hear them before you saw them. Soft footfalls on damp soil, the crackle of branches under cautious weight, the low murmurs of communication traveling through the half-dark. These were not monsters of heat and glare, but masters of nuance, thriving where patience mattered more than power. Their bodies tell the story in microscopic detail. When scientists cut through fossilized bone and examine it under polarized light, they find growth rings, broad during times of abundance, narrow during scarcity. These lines are not just records of age, but of rhythm, the biological tempo of a world that oscillated between feast and lull. During the endless days of summer, young dinosaurs grew quickly, fueling on the explosion of vegetation and prey. Then, as the twilight months settled in, growth slowed but did not stop. The bones show maintenance, not hibernation. Metabolism humming low, steady enough to sustain life through the dim. Evolution had tuned them like instruments, their physiology keeping perfect time with the pulse of the polar year. Feathers played their part, not the sleek, flight-ready veins of later birds, but soft down and filamentous plumes that trapped warmth and likely shimmered with subtle hues. In the long dusk, color would have mattered less for visibility than for meaning. Signals between individuals, patterns that caught the faintest glimmers of light. Feathers could have helped these creatures blend into the half-lit forest, but they were also tools for touch, catching the movement of air, sensing proximity. For small predators like Liaelinosaura and Cryolophosaurus, insulation was only one use. Communication may have been another. In a world of extended twilight, feathers were conversation. The darkness rewrote behavior as well. Herbivores could not rely on sight to find food, so they turned to smell and touch. Their snouts were broad, their nasal cavities complex, an architecture designed for scent. They likely foraged by memory, moving along familiar routes between patches of shade-tolerant plants, tracing the faint aroma of conifer needles and ferns. Their predators followed those same cues, learning the timing of movements, listening for the rustle of leaves. Hunting in such an environment was an act of patience, not pursuit. A predator might wait for hours in silence, blending with trunks and shadows until opportunity passed close enough to strike. Even their eyes evolved for dimness. Fossilized skulls show large orbital cavities, the sockets wide enough to house eyes capable of catching what little light filtered through the canopy. The pupils would have dilated into wide pools, sensitive to the faintest glimmer. But vision alone could not rule here. These creatures relied on multi-sensory worlds, hearing tuned to distant calls, vibrations sensed through the ground, perhaps even pressure changes in the air detected through fine facial filaments. Where tropical dinosaurs dominated by force and spectacle, polar dinosaurs survived through awareness. And they were not alone. The forest itself hummed softly around them. Insects droned beneath the bark, amphibians croaked from slow-moving streams, and the wind carried scents that lingered for hours in the still air. The dinosaurs moved through it like participants in an intricate symphony, each gesture in tune with the world's subdued rhythm. During the bright months, they fed and nested, synchronizing reproduction so that hatchlings emerged into abundance. Young dinosaurs grew quickly, bones expanding in rapid bursts of calcium and collagen, while the forest glowed with endless light. As twilight deepened, they slowed, conserving energy, learning the routes their parents traced, the sounds that meant safety, the patterns that meant danger. Perhaps the most striking adaptation was not physical, but social. Fossil trackways and nesting sites hint that these polar dinosaurs lived in groups. They likely huddled together for warmth, rested in clusters where body heat and companionship offered security. Group vigilance replaced the individual advantage of sharp sight. Survival became a collective act. A rustle in the dark could ripple through the group like a whisper, triggering movement before danger arrived. Twilight, which could have been a threat, became an ally, a cloak for coordinated life. Theirs was a world defined by endurance, not struggle. They did not conquer darkness. They learned its logic. In the dim glow of the polar forest, strength was measured not in size or ferocity, but in sensitivity. The ability to read a world muted by light, to sense the rhythm of unseen things. Their senses filled the gaps that daylight left behind. If you could stand there now, at the edge of a river in that ancient half-light, you might see them only in glimpses. The outline of feathers catching the last reflection on the water, a line of small figures moving in quiet procession through the mist. You might hear their low calls, feel the ground tremble softly as they pass. It would not feel like a prehistoric wilderness of monsters, but something gentler, a living dusk where creatures had learned to make peace with the long shadow of the sun. In that place, survival was not about enduring the cold, but understanding the dark. Along the edges of the ancient Antarctic continent, the sea was warm, green, and alive. Waves rolled gently against shores bordered by forests, where tree roots reached into brackish water and the scent of salt mingled with the breath of soil. There were no ice shelves, no cold deserts of blue and white. Instead, the coastline shimmered with lagoons and estuaries that pulsed with the tides, their surfaces reflecting the slow circles of a sun that never fully set. In those sheltered waters, life thrived, quietly, intricately, and in astonishing abundance. The seas here were nurseries. Rivers carried nutrients down from inland swamps and forests, spilling into shallow bays and deltas. The mingling of fresh and salt water made fertile gradients where plankton flourished and food chains began. Young fish darted through tangles of submerged roots, their silver bodies flashing beneath the soft light. Juvenile ammonites, spiraled shells like floating lanterns, bobbed in the currents, rising and falling with the tides. Crabs and bivalves burrowed into the mud, filtering detritus stirred by each wave. The estuaries breathed in rhythm with the ocean, inhaling during flood tide, exhaling during ebb. Their ecosystems synchronized to that eternal pulse. Warm currents drifting down from the tropics delivered both heat and nourishment. These waters were rich with plankton blooms, turning the shallows turquoise by day and luminous green by night. The abundance rippled upward. Small fish fed on plankton, larger fish on them, and still larger predators followed. In some intervals, marine reptiles ruled these coasts. Plesiosaurs with long necks and sleek ichthyosaurs with bodies shaped for speed. They hunted among shoals of fish, their wakes curling in the sunlit water. Fossilized stomach stones, or gastroliths, found in their remains tell of how they swallowed smooth pebbles to aid digestion and balance, a detail that still echoes the intimate mechanics of a living sea. The evidence of this marine wealth lies written in rock and shell. Carbonate layers on the seafloor captured every fluctuation. In chemistry, every shift between river flood and ocean calm. Isotopes within those shells record the salinity of the water, revealing a pattern as intricate as heartbeat tracings. Pulses of fresh water after storm seasons, steadier marine signatures during years of stability. Each clam, each snail, each microscopic foraminifer became a data point in a record of rhythm. A biological seismograph measuring the world's subtle changes. Sometimes the sea grew loud. Storms swept in from the north, whipping the coast with waves that shattered shells and uprooted marine grasses. Rivers flooded their banks, pouring silt and debris into the estuaries, turning them brown and quieting the reefs. When the waters settled, new communities emerged. Fresh sediments offered space for colonization, and the shells of the dead became foundation for the living. The sea was never still. but it was dependable, rebuilding itself with every breath. At low tide, beaches would have stretched wide and glistening, patterned with ripples left by retreating water. Insects from the forests hovered near the edge, scavenging where fish had stranded. Ammonite shells washed ashore in spirals of pink and cream. Children of that era, small reptiles and amphibians, if not yet mammals, would have prowled the rack line, feeding on what the sea surrendered. To walk along that beach then would be to hear life layered upon life. The clicking of crustaceans, the sigh of waves through mangrove roots, the distant calls of reptiles echoing from the forest behind. Everywhere, there were signs of productivity's ebb and flow. In some fossil beds, shells lie scattered and broken, evidence of predator surges, perhaps when nutrients spiked and food chains accelerated. Bite marks on bones and shells record the choreography of feeding, each gouge a note in a complex score. Yet even these moments of violence were part of the sea's rhythm, part of the constant exchange of energy that kept the ecosystem alive. Over time, these carbonate layers thickened, turning soft mud into stone. Within them, every shell and skeleton became a page of the sea's diary, written in calcium and isotope. The handwriting is precise. The curvature of a bivalve shell tells of gentle currents. The thickness of coral bands measures the seasonality of light. The chemistry of tooth enamel reveals whether the water was brackish or pure. Through them, we can reconstruct the ancient shoreline with uncanny accuracy. Its tides, its floods, its quiet recoveries. Where glaciers now creak and crack, waves once lapped against sunlit coasts. The same cliffs that today rise stark and empty were once coral-tinted shallows where fish darted through kelp and ammonites drifted in schools. Each fossil shell, each ripple mark preserved in stone, is a reminder that Antarctica was not always a kingdom of cold silence. It was once a place of sound and motion, a continent framed by warm margins, where sea and land merged in a constant, generous exchange. The ocean was the first and last author of that age. It wrote in shells and sediments, in isotope ratios and ripple marks. It kept its diary faithfully, patient and precise, chronicling every breath, every tide, every passing storm. And though the ice has long since closed the book, the pages remain, buried beneath the frost, waiting for us to turn them once more and read the sea's remembered song. Even in the gentlest greenhouse world, the sky had moods. Warmth did not mean calm, and sunlight did not promise peace. Over ancient Antarctica, storms were both sculptor and storyteller, reshaping the landscape with every breath. Cyclones rolled inland from the warm seas, their spiral arms dragging curtains of rain across forests and floodplains. Atmospheric rivers, long plumes of vapor drawn from tropical latitudes, uncoiled over the continent like silver ribbons, unloading torrents that fed rivers and drowned valleys. Between those tempests, the air might turn strangely still, the kind of humid pause that seems to hold its breath before the world exhales again. These were not modern tempests confined to coastlines. They were continent-scale rearrangements. The rain came hard enough to change geography. Riverbanks vanished overnight. Channels split, merged, and reformed like thoughts in motion. Each deluge carried the forest with it. Logs stripped of bark, mats of fern roots, soil thick with organic matter. When the waters receded, they left behind layers of new beginnings. Fertile mud that invited ferns, horsetails, and mosses to recolonize. Over time, these sudden episodes became part of the pattern, recorded in stone as storm beds, abrupt, coarse layers interrupting the fine rhythm of calm sediment. Each one a single page written in chaos. To stand in one of those floodplains then would have been to feel the ground alive with motion. The wind howled through trees, bending their trunks until they creaked like old ships. Lightning stitched the horizon in jagged lines. The rain fell not as drops, but as sheets, heavy enough to blur distance. Rivers swelled until they tore through their banks, dragging branches, seeds, and silt toward the lowlands. The storm's roar would have drowned out every animal cry, every rustle of leaves. And yet, even as it destroyed, it prepared the next act. When the skies cleared, sunlight struck a landscape, rearranged and refreshed. Pools shimmered where none had existed before. Sandbars rose as resting places for new life. The world breathed again. Fossils capture the aftermath better than the event itself. In outcrops, you can see the sudden switch from orderly mudstone to chaotic conglomerate. Pebbles and cobbles jumbled together, often cross-cut by the ghostly impressions of uprooted trunks. Some beds hold charcoal, a quiet echo of lightning fires that flared in the storm's wake. After a cyclone passed, its dry tail sometimes brought hot winds that turned debris into kindling. Whole stretches of forest could ignite, smoke rising through air still damp from the rain. But even fire became part of the rhythm. Ash settled into wet soil, adding nutrients that fed the next generation of plants. The storm destroyed, the fire refined, and the rain rebuilt. It was a loop of renewal, not ruin. To life, these tempests were neither curse nor blessing. They were the pulse of the system. Plants that could sprout quickly after burial thrived. Those that demanded stability vanished. Some trees evolved roots that anchored deep into waterlogged ground. Others relied on lightweight seeds that floated and rode the floods to new ground. Insects laid eggs in debris piles, amphibians used flooded hollows as nurseries, and reptiles basked on fresh sandbanks as soon as the sun returned. Every storm rewrote the rules, and every organism learned to read the revisions. The storm's reach extended beyond the land. Rivers flushed vast amounts of sediment and organic carbon into coastal seas, fertilizing marine ecosystems. Plankton blooms followed these influxes, turning waters cloudy with life. The sea, in turn, responded with its own weather, shaping the coastline anew. In this way, land and ocean were not separate stages, but halves of a single performance, each feeding and resetting the other through cycles of disturbance. In a greenhouse climate, energy moved fast. The difference between calm and catastrophe was a question of hours. The warmth that nurtured life also powered instability. Convection towers soared higher, clouds grew heavier, and rainfall more intense. Yet the system remained balanced because life kept pace. The forests did not crumble under volatility. They depended on it. Diversity thrived on the edges of upheaval, where destruction cleared the ground for innovation. If you could walk those landscapes today, frozen under kilometers of ice, you would still see traces of that rhythm. Storm beds gleam as sandy ribbons between dull gray shales, reminders of the sky's handwriting. Each layer captures a moment when the world forgot its stillness and surrendered to motion. And though the storms have been silent for tens of millions of years, the shape of their energy remains etched in stone, a memory of rain that gave as much as it took. In Antarctica's ancient warmth, storms were not disasters. They were metabolism, the way the planet processed excess energy, the way ecosystems refreshed themselves. To live there was to live by that rhythm, to bend with the wind, burrow through the floods, regrow in the ashes, and start again. The storm was not the end of the story. It was the heartbeat that kept the world alive. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon and did not return for months, the Antarctic world did not fall silent. It changed its rhythm. The long twilight deepened into a muted, perpetual dusk, and life responded not with surrender, but with invention. The forests, the rivers, and the creatures that moved through them adjusted to a new kind of time, one that stretched and folded like slow breathing. The polar night was not an absence of light. It was a recalibration of life's heartbeat. For plants, the challenge was both simple and profound. How to live when photosynthesis paused. Evergreen conifers, with their narrow needles, stored energy in slow trickles, conserving rather than producing. Their chlorophyll stayed intact, ready to flare into action when the first returning light kissed the canopy. Deciduous trees took another route. They shed leaves before the dusk deepened, retreating inward to rely on stored sugars and starches buried in root and bark. In the quiet beneath their branches, decomposers got to work. Fungi and bacteria broke down the autumn's litter, feeding detritivores, those patient eaters of yesterday's sunlight. Beetles, worms, and scavenging crustaceans turned the dead into fuel, passing energy along a chain that never truly stopped moving. Even in darkness, the forest fed itself. Animals, too, developed their choreography for the long blink. Small reptiles sought warmth and stillness in burrows lined with damp moss. Amphibians wedged into the mud near riverbanks, slowing their breathing until the air barely stirred in their lungs. Insect life retreated underground or inside rotting logs, where the temperature fluctuated little and the moisture stayed constant. The polar night was not a freeze, but a slow simmer, a season of lowered expectations and careful savings. Larger animals adjusted in more elaborate ways. Some may have migrated northward along the broad river corridors that cut across the continent, following the faint promise of longer days and richer feeding grounds. Others stayed put, evolving strategies that blurred the lines between wakefulness and dormancy. Dinosaurs, those adaptable rulers of the Mesozoic, might have relied on group warmth, huddling in sheltered glades, conserving body heat while maintaining low but steady activity. The fossilized growth rings in their bones suggest that metabolism did not halt during the long dark. Instead, it throttled back, matching the tempo of the dim world above. Beneath the rivers and shallow seas, life had its own equations to balance. Fish that swam in those waters faced not the killing chill of modern Antarctic seas, but a cool stability. Temperatures low enough to slow, not freeze. Modern polar fish make antifreeze proteins in their blood, a molecular shield against ice. Their ancient relatives likely managed in subtler ways, tuning enzymes to function at cooler temperatures without losing speed. They lived in the narrow band between motion and stillness, each heartbeat measured, each breath efficient. In the soil and under the bark, time blurred. Some insects shortened their life cycles to take advantage of the endless summer light, racing through generations before darkness set in. Others stretched them, entering dormant stages that lasted through the night, months. The forest floor became a mosaic of tiny clocks, each ticking at a different pace. A few species may have synced their rhythms to the faint lunar glow or the pull of tides in nearby estuaries, anchors of regularity in a world without sunrise. What held all these strategies together was flexibility. The organisms of ancient Antarctica lived in a place that defied simple categories of day and night, summer and winter. Their success depended on swapping rigid routines for adaptability, on writing their lives in pencil rather than ink. Energy moved in circles rather than lines. Plants fed decomposers, decomposers fed scavengers, and the cycle fed back into the roots, waiting for dawn. The landscape itself learned to cooperate. Hollow trees became shelters, riverbanks turned into corridors of movement. Caves, burrows, and fallen logs softened the edges of the cold and moderated humidity. Inside these hidden chambers, warmth and life lingered. The world outside might dim into near silence, but inside those small refuges, hearts still beat and wings still twitched. Survival depended not on dominance, but on gentleness, on knowing how to yield to the season without breaking. To imagine that time is to think of sound more than sight. The slow drip of water from thawing soil, the rustle of something stirring underground, the faint hum of respiration beneath layers of bark. The forest's pulse was slower but steady. The polar night was not a barrier, but a passage, a long hallway leading from one chapter of life to the next. When the sun finally rose again, it did not return to a dead world. Shoots were already pushing through the thawing soil. Insects unfolded damp wings. Rivers quickened with runoff. Everything that had waited in darkness stepped forward, as though the night had been less asleep and more a deep inhale. The long blink ended, and life exhaled into light once more, ready to begin the cycle again. The ground beneath our feet is never truly still, no matter how solid it feels. Antarctica's journey through time was not marked by a single dramatic moment, but by the slow, steady rearrangement of continents, a planetary migration that unfolded in silence. Gondwana, that great southern supercontinent, began to fracture, its seams splitting along zones of weakness, where heat and pressure quietly built for ages. As Africa, India, South America, and Australia drifted away, Antarctica was left to wander southward, sliding toward the pole like a passenger on a slow-moving raft. It did not rush. It simply moved, centimeter by centimeter, its destiny rewritten not by storms or creatures, but by the deep machinery of the earth itself. At first, its journey went almost unnoticed by the life that covered it. Forests still spread across its surface, rivers still coiled through lowlands, and creatures still moved through ferns and conifers. But change accumulates the way dust does, quietly, persistently, until one day the world looks entirely different. As Antarctica drifted, the angle of sunlight that touched its land grew shallower, and the seasons stretched wider apart. The warm breath of the tropics no longer reached so easily. Storm tracks began to shift, drawn toward the new shapes of emerging seas. Winds strengthened, currents bent, and the planet's heat began to circulate along new paths. The separation from South America and Australia was more than a geographic divorce. It was the beginning of a climatic transformation. As the seas widened between these continents, new channels opened for ocean water to flow. Where once there had been enclosed basins, now there were open corridors. Warm currents that once caressed the Antarctic coast began to thin and weaken, replaced slowly by cooler ones drawn from the deep. The atmosphere responded in kind. New temperature gradients altered where rain fell, how clouds formed, and which regions grew lush or dry. It was not an overnight shift, but a symphony of subtle rearrangements, with each note echoing across millions of years. These drifting miles mattered more than any storm, fire, or flood that had come before. A storm lasts days, a volcanic eruption years. But the motion of a tectonic plate carries consequences that span eras. As Antarctica edged farther poleward, its ecosystems adjusted in increments, species migrating northward, others adapting to longer winters and shorter summers. The forests grew sparser, wetlands shrank, and the once thick canopy began to thin into open woodland. Rivers slowed as mountain belts rose and drained differently. It was as if the continent were exhaling, preparing itself for the cold breath that would one day arrive. If you could stand at a single spot and watch through time-lapse eyes, you would see everything around you morph with agonizing grace. The horizon would tilt as mountains rose. Seas would advance and retreat like tides drawn by invisible hands, and the constellations overhead would slide ever so slightly across the sky as latitude shifted. The sun, once high and direct, would lower its arc each year until summer light slanted and winter dimness deepened. Yet the land itself, though moving thousands of kilometers, would not feel the journey. It simply carried its memories. Coal seams from the swamp years, red beds from the flood years, glacial scratches from the ice years, all layered and compressed into silent testimony. The Earth's crust behaves like a slow tide beneath the continents. Deep beneath the ice that now crowns Antarctica, molten rock still circulates, dragging the outer shell along. The planet is restless by nature, forever sculpting itself anew. The separation of Gondwana rewrote the ocean basins, redrew the air currents, and, without intention, prepared the conditions for future ice. When Antarctica finally drifted far enough south and the circumpolar current sealed it off, the transformation became irreversible. The lever had been pulled long before the outcome was visible. This is the quiet truth of climate. It listens to the continents. When land shifts, the air and water obey. The position of mountains dictates rain. The width of oceans determines circulation. The placement of a single land bridge can reroute evolution itself. Antarctica's slide to the pole did not just change its own fate, it changed the planet's. The global engine of climate found a new gear, and the world began to cool. In the rocks that underlie the modern ice sheet, you can still read the record of this motion. Magnetic minerals, frozen at the moment they formed, point like tiny compasses toward where the pole once was. Their alignment tells the story of drift, of motion through space and time. Each grain of rock remembers where the sun once sat overhead and how the oceans once wrapped their arms around the coast. The stones do not complain, nor do they mourn what has passed. They only record. To them, a million years is a sentence, a continent's journey a paragraph. And as they lie silent beneath the weight of ice, they continue to keep the planet's diary, an unbroken narrative of distance, sunlight, and change. There was a moment, imperceptible in human time, when the Earth's great oceans found a new path. The continents had drifted just far enough apart, South America sliding westward, Antarctica holding steady near the pole, for water to slip between them. It began as a narrow strait, a cautious flow between two land masses that had once shared rivers and forests. But as the gap widened, the current strengthened, and the planet's circulation changed forever. The Drake Passage had opened, and with it, the warm breath of the world could no longer reach the southernmost land. The ocean had drawn a curtain of motion, and behind it, cold began to gather its strength. Before this opening, the seas had been a web of exchange. Warm currents from the tropics wandered freely southward, wrapping Antarctica in temperate water that kept its coasts green and its rivers liquid. The marine life along those shores depended on that warmth. The flow of nutrients, the steady temperatures, the rhythm of upwelling that fed fish and plankton alike. When the passage between South America and Antarctica deepened, that balance broke. For the first time, a continuous loop of cold water could race around the continent without interruption. The Antarctic circumpolar current was born, a vast, unending river of sea that spins west to east around the world. It became a moat no fire could cross. The current isolated Antarctica from the rest of the planet's climate system, deflecting tropical warmth northward and trapping cold air above the pole. In that encirclement, the first seeds of glaciation found ground. Snow that once melted in the summer began to linger. Year by year, century by century, it built upon itself. compressing into ice that crept downhill and did not retreat. Rivers slowed, froze, and then were reborn as ice, streams, massive grinding flows that sculpted valleys and fjords. The forests retreated inland, shrinking with every passing millennium until they vanished entirely, leaving only tundra, then lichens, then silence. It is easy to imagine this as an abrupt transformation. But the truth is subtler, more patient. The world did not wake one morning to an Antarctica entombed in white. It unfolded like pages turning in a book, each one thinner than you'd expect, each carrying only a trace of change. A colder season here, a longer winter there. A shift in the species of pollen buried in a lake bed. The story of ice begins quietly. The first snowfall that never melted was just a momentary imbalance, one that became permanent through repetition. The planet does not need haste. It only needs consistency. Feedbacks gathered. As snow and ice accumulated, their brightness reflected more sunlight back into space, cooling the air further. The albedo effect, the planet's mirror, became a self-reinforcing spiral. The colder it grew, the more snow persisted. The more snow persisted, the colder it became. Winds sharpened as temperature gradients steepened. The forests that had shaded riverbanks for millions of years began to thin. Seeds that once drifted on summer breezes fell on frozen soil and never sprouted. The last ferns were not killed by a storm or fire, but by absence. A gradual loss of warmth, of growing season, of the invisible stability life depends upon. The end came not as a scream, but as a long, slow forgetting. The animals followed the plants. Herbivores vanished first, their food disappearing beneath frost. The predators that depended on them lingered, hunting along rivers that froze thinner each year, until even those paths vanished. Insects dwindled to a few hardy species. Amphibians disappeared from their shallow ponds. The forests that had once hummed with sound fell silent, replaced by the low moan of wind moving across open plains. It was not extinction by violence, but by distance, the slow drifting apart of life from the conditions that once sustained it. Geography had written a new rule, and every living thing was forced to read it. In the oceans surrounding the continent, the transformation was equally profound. The same current that sealed Antarctica in cold began to drive nutrient-rich waters upward elsewhere, feeding blooms that supported marine life in faraway seas. The loss of warmth in one place became abundance in another. The Earth balances its books with precision. Energy removed from the south was redistributed to the north. The birth of Antarctica's ice was, paradoxically, a spark for productivity elsewhere. The planet systems are never idle. They simply trade, exchange, and adapt. Eventually, the continent reached its new equilibrium, a white desert crowned in glaciers, circled by the most powerful current on Earth. The rocks beneath the ice remember the forests that once grew there, their roots fossilized, their soils frozen in place. The rivers have become tunnels of blue light, flowing beneath hundreds of meters of compacted snow. The same coastline that once welcomed crocodiles now greets only penguins and seals. The transformation is absolute, but its origins remain invisible to the eye, hidden not in catastrophe, but in slow inevitability. The Drake Passage was not merely an ocean opening. It was the hinge on which a climate turned. In its quiet widening, it taught the planet to hold cold, to sustain a pole of stillness amid motion. And though it took millions of years for ice to claim the land, the decision was made the moment the first current flowed through that gap. The Earth had opened a door, and behind it, winter was waiting. It began so gently that no one, not even the planet itself, could have called it an ending. The first snows that stayed were unremarkable, just a few stubborn drifts that refused to yield to the returning sun. For countless seasons before, winter's snow had always vanished, soaking back into rivers and soil, feeding the green surge of summer. But then, in certain places, on the high plateaus, along the shaded valleys, the melt came slower, the thaw incomplete. White lingered where brown and green had ruled. It was not yet ice, only memory. But memory has a way of growing heavy. Altitude joined hands with latitude, and together they conspired with time. The air thinned, temperatures dipped, and the storms carried more snow than the summer could erase. Layer fell upon layer, season upon season, the weight compacting the lower drifts into dense, crystalline firn. Snow in the process of becoming ice. Under its own pressure, it began to flow, almost imperceptibly at first. Grains sliding past one another, then locking into alignment like soldiers settling into ranks. This was the slow birth of glaciers, not as grand rivers of ice yet, but as hesitant tongues testing the edges of the valleys, learning the contours of the land. The forests that had once thrived along these slopes began to retreat upward, seeking sunlight that now reached them for fewer hours each day. Conifers clung to ridges, their roots gripping permafrost that crept deeper each year. Below them, shrubs and ferns gave way to mosses and lichens, small things that could sleep through the cold and wake when brief warmth returned. The soil froze hard enough to crack roots and stones alike. Streams that once sang all summer long now ran shorter and slower, their headwaters sealed under the new glaze of permanence. As the glaciers grew, they became sculptors, carving with the patience of gravity. Their undersides, armed with embedded stones, ground valleys into smooth U-shapes. Moraines, heaps of rock and gravel pushed aside or left behind, marked their progress like punctuation across the landscape. Each ridge of debris was a pause, a breath between advances. To the glaciers, every boulder was a word, every valley a sentence rewritten in the language of ice. Still, even as the white advanced, small pockets of warmth refused to surrender. North-facing slopes basked in a few extra degrees of sunlight. Geothermal seeps, those quiet exhalations from the planet's interior, kept tiny oases alive where mosses stayed green beneath the frost. In these refuges, remnants of the old world persisted. A few insects clung to existence in leaf litter that thawed for an hour at midday. Amphibians hid in mineral springs that never quite froze. Even plants, stripped of grandeur, survived as memories of forests reduced to whispers of chlorophyll. These enclaves were time's stowaways, sheltered in the folds of a world changing around them. From above, the transformation would have been both breathtaking and sorrowful. A continent being repainted in pale strokes. Rivers once winding through forests now gleamed like silver veins against the white. Lakes froze solid except for dark cores kept open by the wind. The sky itself seemed to change color, its light reflecting off the snow and filling the air with a kind of bright quiet. The sounds of living things grew fewer. The murmur of wind and cracking ice became the dominant music. Antarctica was beginning to hum a new song, one with a slower tempo, written in a colder key. The change did not erase the past, it sealed it. Beneath the thickening mantle of snow, the continent hid its keepsakes. Coal seams, born of ancient forests, were buried deeper. Petrified wood, once exposed to the weather, disappeared under drifts that would not lift again for millions of years. Fossils of ferns and amphibians, once close enough to touch, were tucked away like mementos in a box under a cold bed. The new Antarctica did not discard its history. It preserved it with ruthless tenderness. pressing memory into permafrost. There must have been centuries when both worlds coexisted, the green and the white, the living and the dormant. Valleys where snowmelt still trickled through the roots of dying trees, plateaus where glaciers advanced by a few meters each year, while birds nested in the last open branches below. The transition was not a fall, but a fading, like breath condensing and vanishing on glass. By the time the forests were gone, the land beneath them had already forgotten warmth. The first snows that stayed marked not a catastrophe, but a decision. The earth had tilted slightly, breathed differently, turned one more page in its long narrative. The greenhouse coda had played its final notes, and the overture of the cryosphere began. Softly, persistently, like a distant percussion of snowflakes settling into permanence. Antarctica had chosen its new form, and under the quiet weight of white, it kept its old stories safe, waiting for the rare chance when someone would come again to read them. Even as the great current spun itself into permanence and the cold began to stake its claim, the planet was not done with warmth. Climate, like memory, resists a clean ending. The Eocene was Earth's last lingering glow before the deep freeze, a long, slow exhale of greenhouse warmth that briefly rekindled what had seemed lost. Across the world, forests reached farther north and south than logic should have allowed. Rainforests stretched into what are now temperate zones. Crocodiles and turtles basked in places they would one day abandon. Even Antarctica, by then already slipping toward isolation, caught the echo of that warmth. The ice hesitated. Rivers ran free again for a time. The green light flickered one last time before dimming for good. On the edges of the continent, the sediments remember it. In layers younger than expected, geologists find the unmistakable traces of broadleaf plants. Pollen grains shaped like teardrops, tiny but undeniable. Their presence tells of brief reprieves when the circumpolar current faltered or the atmosphere thickened with carbon again. These were not full returns to the lush forests of old, but flickers, lanterns burning low in a coldening world. Short intervals when air grew moist, temperatures lifted, and soil thawed long enough for shrubs and small trees to take root. The forests that rose from these moments were smaller, humbler, but no less miraculous. They were the Earth's reminder that endings can hesitate. The Eocene's warmth was global, not local. Volcanic outgassing, continental rearrangements, and feedbacks from ocean chemistry all conspired to trap more heat. CO2 levels climbed to heights not seen since the Mesozoic, and the poles responded first. Sea levels rose, pushing shallow waters farther inland. The air grew heavy with humidity. Clouds thickened, softening temperature extremes. Antarctica's coasts once more wore a faint green fringe, a necklace of vegetation tracing bays and river mouths, with mossy undergrowth and scattered trees clinging to life in brief, forgiving summers. In those short centuries of reprieve, frogs may have croaked again in meltwater pools, and insects buzzed through the air, oblivious to the enormity of their borrowed time. But the balance was delicate. Even in its warmth, the planet was unstable, oscillating between pulses of heat and cool regressions. Each spike of temperature rearranged wind belts, altered rainfall, and sent waves of extinction rippling across the tropics. The Eocene glow was not peace, it was fever. In the fossil record, you can see the rhythm of it. Dark organic layers marking swamp growth, alternating with pale mineral bands laid down during droughts. The land was breathing too fast, trying to find equilibrium between ice and fire. When the warmth finally waned again, it did so with a long sigh. Forests withdrew for the last time, their roots replaced by the creeping advance of frost. The pollen records grow sparse, the diversity of plant life narrowing into a few cold-tolerant survivors. Yet even in this retreat, something of the warmth lingered in the planet's chemistry, stored in the carbonates of shells, the isotopes of ice cores, the trapped gases of sediment pores. The memory of heat became part of the geological body, dormant but not dead. And it remains there still, whispering a warning. Climate does not move in straight lines. It wobbles, hesitates, and sometimes backtracks. The Eocene warmth reminds us that the planet can return to its green state far faster than we might imagine, if the levers of temperature and carbon are pulled hard enough. Antarctica's buried forests are not inert relics, but testimonies of resilience. They show that given the right mixture of humidity, sunlight, and softened currents, the South can bloom again. Green is patient. It waits. Imagine standing there, on an Eocene shoreline of what is now the Ross Sea. The air would feel thick, the light hazy through mist. Broadleaf trees lean over quiet water, their roots woven into dark, wet soil. Insects flit between ferns that sweat in the heat. The scent is of resin and wet bark. To the east, low hills glow faintly with morning sun, streaked with fog. It looks eternal, but it is not. Within a few million years, a heartbeat in planetary time, it will all vanish beneath ice. The warmth is a guest that has overstayed its welcome, and soon the door will close for millions of years. Yet even as it does, the Earth keeps the key. Every fossilized leaf, every preserved grain of pollen is proof that warmth can return, not as myth or nostalgia, but as physics. The Eocene's last lanterns flickered out slowly, their embers buried beneath frost. But their lesson remains unextinguished. The planet remembers how to be green. If the air thickens again, if the oceans open their arms once more, the ghosts of those forests will test the door. And if they find it unlatched, they will walk through. Every discovery in the frozen South begins with disbelief. The mind resists the idea of warmth beneath such enduring cold. It feels like a contradiction, a trick of imagination, to picture forests where glaciers now groan and creak. Yet the Earth keeps its receipts, and they are written in stone. Skepticism is welcome, necessary even. But in the face of evidence, it becomes something else. Wonder. For Antarctica, that continent of silence, speaks fluently when asked the right questions. Its rocks do not exaggerate, they only answer. The testimonies are many and varied. In some valleys, petrified wood still stands upright, the trunks frozen in place where they once grew. You can run your fingers across the grain, count the growth rings that record seasons long vanished. These are not driftwood relics carried by ocean currents. They are trees rooted in the same ground they grew from, still anchored to ancient soils. Elsewhere, coal seams stretch for kilometers, black veins of compacted plant matter that could not exist without dense vegetation and sustained warmth. Each seam is a compressed forest, a chapter of sunshine distilled into carbon, preserved beneath layers of ash and sediment. Leaf impressions tell the subtler parts of the story. In slabs of shale, you can see the silhouettes of ferns, ginkgos, and broadleaf plants, their veins etched like delicate script. Some are so precise that you can see where insects nibbled at their edges. The diversity of leaf shapes and sizes reveals the climate that birthed them. Pointed tips for heavy rainfall, broad surfaces for low light conditions. Even in fragments, they whisper of humidity, of long seasons of growth. Microscopic pollen adds another layer of truth. Extracted from sediments and viewed through a lens, each grain carries the signature of its species, a geometric fingerprint that ties Antarctica to its ancient siblings in India, Africa, and Australia. the same kinds appear across all of Gondwana's former territories, confirming that these continents were once neighbors, sharing not just geography, but ecosystems. The pollen is a bridge across both distance and time, an unbroken connection between lands that drifted apart but once breathed the same air. Animal fossils lend movement to this quiet world. In some outcrops, vertebrate bones emerge. Reptiles that basked along riverbanks, amphibians that hid in swamps, and small dinosaurs adapted to polar twilight. Marine layers contain ammonites, fish, and shells that once lived in warm seas rich with plankton. The shell's chemistry preserves the isotopic fingerprints of the water they formed in, allowing scientists to reconstruct temperature and salinity. These measurements are not metaphors. They are numbers, oxygen-18 ratios, carbon isotopic shifts, data that translate the poetry of the past into proof. Paleosols, ancient soils now turned to rock, reveal the rhythms of weather and vegetation. Root traces crisscross their surfaces, and horizons rich in iron or organic matter show cycles of wet and dry, of growth and decay. They prove that the land was once alive, breathing through seasons of rain and light. Between these soil layers lie volcanic ash beds, perfect timestamps containing minerals that can be radiometrically dated. Those ash layers allow scientists to synchronize events across continents, to say with confidence that a forest in Antarctica burned and regrew at the same time as one in Australia. When all these lines of evidence are layered together, they form harmony. Alone, each piece has noise, ambiguity, the limits of interpretation. But together, they sing in key. The story that emerges is not guesswork. It is synthesis. The warmth was real. The forests were real. The rivers and the rain and the animals that drank from them. All real. The evidence does not care for human disbelief. It sits in the ground, patient, waiting for us to listen. Science does not ask for faith. It offers curiosity in return. It builds truth from fragments, from data that overlap and reinforce, until even the most improbable story becomes undeniable. And if the story happens to sound beautiful, if it reads like a bedtime tale whispered by the planet itself, that is not myth-making. It is coherence. The universe, after all, has always been a poet of patterns. To study the fossils of Antarctica is to read an autobiography written by the Earth in the only ink that does not fade: stone, carbon, and time. Each proxy, wood, leaf, coal, shell, isotope, is a paragraph, together composing a narrative both humbling and grounding. The claim isn't that it felt warm once. The claim is measured, layered, cross-checked. Here is the temperature, here the humidity, here the chemical and physical proof. From these pieces, we build understanding. And in that understanding lies comfort. Not because the past was safe, it wasn't, but because it shows that change is woven into the planet's nature. Antarctica has been swamp and forest, desert and glacier. It has worn many costumes and will again. The rocks do not moralize. They only remind us that stability is the illusion, motion the rule. The story they tell is not meant to lull us, but to wake us, to teach that the ground beneath us is alive with history, and that wisdom comes from learning to listen. The creatures that once lived in the warmth of Antarctica's high latitudes never fought the planet's moods. They learned its rhythm. In a land of half-year days and half-year nights, of rain one century and frost the next, survival depended not on domination, but on adaptability. The forests, rivers, and animals that flourished there understood this long before humans arrived to measure it. They thrived not because their world was stable, but because it wasn't. Every living thing on that shifting continent became a student of change. In the polar forests, plants invented patience. They learned to grow quickly when the light came, to slow their pulse when it faded, to store energy not in defiance of darkness, but in partnership with it. Trees measured time not by temperature, but by light, stretching their needles toward the endless summer sun, then sleeping lightly through the long dusk. Their roots spoke to fungi underground, sharing carbon and nutrients through threads that laced the soil like whisper networks. When floods tore through valleys or ash from distant volcanoes blanketed the land, these networks helped rebuild. Ferns sprouted first. Ferns always do. Their spores rode the wind like scouts, claiming ground before roots could follow. Insects returned next, feeding on the new shoots, restarting the engine of decay and renewal. Adaptation was not improvisation. It was rehearsal, practiced over millions of years. Animals, too, moved with the world's unpredictability. Some migrated with the shifting seasons, following warmth or water. Others changed their tempo instead, breeding when resources peaked, resting when they waned. Small reptiles might have slowed their metabolism through the dark months, while amphibians hid in damp soil until rain returned. Even the dinosaurs of the polar forests understood flexibility. Bone studies show alternating patterns of rapid and slow growth, evidence of bodies attuned to abundance and scarcity. They didn't conquer the cold or the dark. They synchronized with it. They lived in choreography with the turning earth. The ecosystems themselves were not hierarchies, but dances. When storms flooded the lowlands, fish and amphibians used the new waters to breed. When fires opened clearings, light-hungry ferns and pioneer plants rushed in. After years of calm, conifers reclaimed dominance, only to lose it again to disturbance. Each role in this drama depended on all the others. No single species ruled for long, because no condition stayed fixed long enough for permanence. In that way, the system remained healthy. Not because it was unchanging, but because it knew how to change. It's tempting to imagine stability as safety, but the history beneath Antarctica's ice tells a different story. Resilience came from diversity, not uniformity, from mobility, not rootedness. Life survived the continent's wild swings by building redundancy into its systems, multiple ways to feed, to reproduce, to endure. When one strategy failed, another filled the gap. Even ecosystems have contingency plans. The ferns knew what to do when trees fell. The scavengers knew how to thrive when hunters disappeared. The web of life was woven loose enough to bend, but tight enough not to break. The forest rings preserved in fossil wood whisper a lesson still relevant. Plan for the season you don't want, and harvest during the one you do. Growth rings widen when times are good, narrow when times are lean. But the sequence continues regardless. Each ring is a conversation between resilience and restraint, a record of balance. The trees did not resist their environment. They absorbed its rhythm and translated it into survival. Today, we stand under a different sky, but face the same truth. The climate is shifting again, not slowly this time, but with alarming speed. And the question is the same one life faced in Antarctica's twilight: how to adapt without collapsing. The solutions, though ancient, remain familiar. Diversify what you rely on. Build systems that can flex. Leave room for redundancy, for improvisation, for the unexpected. Value cooperation over control. Humility may be our most crucial adaptation. The polar forests thrived not by commanding their environment, but by listening to it, by responding rather than dictating. They accepted the unpredictability of the sky and found ways to make it livable, Perhaps our task is similar. To learn when to store energy, when to rest, when to move, when to grow. To design our cities, economies, and societies with the same grace that once animated those ancient ecosystems. Adaptation is not surrender. It is choreography, the art of moving with a partner whose steps you cannot predict. The Earth has always changed tempo. The dancers who endure are the ones who adjust. In that sense, the story of Antarctica's vanished forests is not only about what was lost, but what endures in us. The capacity to learn the rhythm of change and to keep moving even when the music shifts. Imagine for a moment that the world turned its clock backward and Antarctica once again wore its green skin. The ice melts, the rivers return, and the long white silence becomes a landscape of color and breath. Now picture people, us, settling in this polar Eden, not as conquerors, but as residents of a place that demands rhythm over control. What would it mean to live there? Beneath a sky that offers months of light and months of dusk. How would we build, grow, celebrate, and rest in a world that refuses the neat alternation of day and night, summer and winter? The first challenge would be time itself. In the endless light of summer, sleep would have to be learned again. Curtains drawn not to keep out heat, but to simulate night. To remind the body when to dream. During the long twilight of winter, light would become sacred, rationed, and celebrated. Communities might time their festivals to the slow turning of the sun, marking not dates on a calendar, but the changing hues of the sky. A solstice would feel less like an astronomical event and more like an emotional one. The promise that light, however faint, will always return. Agriculture would reinvent itself. Crops would not be arranged in tidy seasons, but in cycles tuned to the extremes of light and darkness. Fields might be layered with shade-tolerant species that thrive in low sun angles, broad-leafed vegetables, root plants storing energy underground, mossy grains that germinate in dimness. Greenhouses would mimic the balance of old ecosystems, capturing the brief abundance of the bright months and slowly releasing it during the dark. Farmers would work like conductors of light, orchestrating growth through reflection, timing, and stored warmth. Harvest festivals might come twice a year, the second not from new growth, but from well-kept stores of the first. Architecture would follow suit. Homes would stretch long to catch horizontal light. Windows angled toward the low arc of the sun. Roofs might grow gardens of moss and fern, capturing moisture from the heavy air. The materials would come from the land itself. Laminated woods cured in the humid summers, mud composites strengthened by volcanic ash, stone insulated by air gaps to hold warmth through the night. Villages would sit beside rivers that never freeze completely, drawing energy from their steady flow. Wind turbines would hum across plateaus, powered by the same persistent gales that once drove ancient storms. The air, thick with moisture, would carry the scent of vegetation rather than the metallic chill of ice. Life here would move in gradients rather than binaries. People might migrate seasonally, not across continents, but vertically, descending to coastal plains when the highlands cool, climbing back up when heat floods return. Each altitude would have its own culture, its own rhythm of light and growth. Trade would follow these vertical routes. Fruits from the lowlands exchanged for grains from the hills, freshwater fish swapped for mountain herbs. It would be a world of slow motion, where patience is survival and timing is wealth. Diet would reflect the landscape's demands. Perennials and hardy roots would dominate, foods that ask little but give much. Storage would be an art form, fermenting, drying, preserving, ways of bottling sunlight for the season of shadows. Meals might center on warmth rather than flavor, shared communally in long, dim evenings that stretch without clock or calendar. Fire would return as both utility and symbol, a memory of the sun brought indoors. And yet, even in this imagined paradise, constraints would shape every act. The long light would challenge the mind as much as the dark. Crops would strain under sudden floods. Winds could tear at structures built too proudly. Humidity would foster both life and decay in equal measure. The same richness that feeds growth would also invite rot. Living here would require humility, a willingness to coexist with volatility rather than to master it. The exercise is not a blueprint. It is a lens through which to view the past more clearly. Thinking about how humans might survive in a warm polar world helps us glimpse what ancient plants and animals already solved. The ferns that spread in the twilight knew how to time growth. The dinosaurs that walked the long dusk understood how to feed without sunlight. They lived in harmony with the planet's strangeness. So could we, if necessity returned us to that lesson. But the thought experiment also sharpens the present. Civilization, for all its sophistication, still leans on stable seasons, on predictable rain, on a sky that behaves. When those patterns wobble, we feel it first in our fields, then in our cities, then in our minds. We have built our world around expectations that the planet never promised to keep. To imagine life in a polar Eden is to remember that adaptability is not fantasy. It is the rule. It is to see that even paradise comes with challenges, that warmth is not safety, and that survival has always been a partnership between ingenuity and restraint. The lesson Antarctica once taught to ferns and reptiles remains waiting for us. The Earth does not yield to us. It invites us to dance. The ancient Antarctic world was a study in contradictions, lush yet volatile, generous yet cruel. To walk through it, had we been able, would have been to move through a place both breathtaking and treacherous. Imagine forests drenched in amber twilight, rivers glimmering with the reflection of a low, endless sun, air alive with the hum of insects and the murmur of water. The ground underfoot would have been soft with moss and ferns, fragrant and damp. But look closer, and you'd see scars, trees blackened from lightning fires, flood debris tangled in branches, fresh growth pushing through ash. In that world, beauty and hazard were not opposites. They were partners in an endless waltz. Every fossil bears witness to this paradox. The same rock layer that preserves delicate impressions of leaves also holds shards of charcoal, proof that the forest once burned. You can trace the curve of a fern frond and, just inches away, see where the soil was scoured by a sudden torrent. Each layer of sediment tells of rhythm interrupted, growth cut short, then reborn. It is tempting to see only the serenity of the prehistoric landscape, to imagine the warm polar forests as utopian gardens. But the evidence reminds us that even paradise was restless. Antarctica's warmth did not protect it from extremes, it amplified them. A moist, oxygen-rich atmosphere meant storms built easily, gathering strength over open seas and crashing inland with torrential rain. Rivers swelled, eroding their banks, shifting course overnight. Lightning found easy targets in the tall conifers, setting the canopy ablaze. Smoke and steam mingled in the heavy air, and for a time, the forest glowed red instead of green. Yet even as one patch burned, another burst into life. Ferns and cicads colonized the ashes, converting destruction into renewal. Fire was not an enemy, but a sculptor, shaping diversity by forcing rebirth. Floods, too, had their double face. They swept away soil and nests and roots. But they also spread nutrients and fresh sediments, resetting the ecological stage. Fish thrived in the new oxbow lakes. Amphibians laid eggs in puddles that hadn't existed a week before, and insects swarmed over driftwood islands. The floods carried death and opportunity in equal measure. To the creatures that lived through them, catastrophe was not an aberration, but a cycle, a recurring stanza in the poem of life. Even the quiet times held danger. The air itself was thick and humid, a greenhouse blend of warmth and decay. Disease spread easily in such climates. Insects multiplied without pause. Predators lurked in the dappled half-light where the sun never climbed high enough to banish shadow. Yet from this chaos came a kind of harmony, an equilibrium built on disturbance. Stability did not mean stillness. It meant constant motion that balanced itself over long spans of time. We tend to romanticize lost worlds. It is a human reflex to see ancient forests as pure, untouched Edens before the fall. But the fossil record is bluntly honest. It shows splendor earned through struggle. Ecosystems that rehearsed for disaster until recovery became muscle memory. Plants that evolved to sprout quickly after fire, animals that could move or burrow at the first tremor of floodwater, microbial communities that stitched soils back together after storms. These were not fragile utopias, but flexible survivors. Their beauty was inseparable from the hazard that shaped it. There's a lesson here that stretches beyond paleontology. Every thriving system, whether a forest, a coral reef, or a civilization, carries within it the seeds of disturbance. Perfection isn't the absence of risk. It's the capacity to adapt when risk arrives. The warmth that fed those polar jungles also powered the lightning that burned them. The rivers that nourished roots were the same ones that drowned them. Recovery, not permanence, was the measure of success. Even today, the echoes of that lesson hum beneath the ice. Antarctica's rocks remember not just the times of growth, but the interruptions that made growth possible. The charred layers and storm scars are not footnotes. They are central to the story. They tell us that balance does not mean peace. It means resilience. It means having enough diversity, enough flexibility, enough stored energy to rebound. The beauty of those ancient landscapes lay in their impermanence, in their ability to survive transformation again and again. Perhaps that is the most haunting part of all. Not that the forests vanished, but that they did so many times and yet returned, reborn from ash and silt and sunlight. Every fern that unfurled after a fire, every seed that floated down a flooded river, carried within it the memory of disaster and the instinct to try again. To honor that world is not to paint it as idyllic, but to respect the resilience woven through its every layer. The green shimmer of the ancient poles was not a gift. It was an achievement, earned, tested, and earned again. And perhaps that is the truest beauty of all. A world that could burn and bloom, drown and thrive, fracture and heal, without ever forgetting the music that bound its chaos together. The ice may have erased the forests, but the forests did not vanish completely. Their roots linger, not in the ground, but in the code of life itself. Every species alive today carries echoes of ancient adaptations, faint fingerprints of those who learned to live where the sun moved strangely and the rain came in pulses. In the warm polar world, organisms evolved tricks, ways to cope with the extremes of light and moisture, that proved too useful to discard. And though the continents drifted, climates flipped, and the cast of species changed, those tricks remained tucked inside DNA, waiting for new stages to perform on. The record of this inheritance is subtle, written not in fossils, but in molecular whispers. When scientists compare the genomes of living conifers, they find patterns that speak of endurance, genes that allow photosynthesis to idle through low light, to conserve energy through months of dimness. Some of these same genetic pathways appear in evergreen shrubs that grow under northern snow or in mountain fog belts where light is filtered and fleeting. These are not coincidences. They are signatures of an ancient necessity to survive when day and night no longer mean what they should. In insects, too, the past hums beneath the wings. Circadian rhythms, the molecular clocks that tell cells when to wake, eat, and rest, show remarkable flexibility in polar-capable species. They can stretch or compress their cycles, adjusting to months of light or darkness without losing track of the seasons. The ancestors of these creatures learned that lesson long ago, perhaps when the Antarctic twilight lasted half a year. The same genes that now help Arctic midges or alpine beetles cope with extreme daylight once helped their deep-time relatives synchronize life to a tilted planet. Evolution does not delete effective strategies. It tucks them away like tools in a workshop drawer. Reptiles, those warm world survivors, offer another glimpse of this legacy. Their metabolism is a language of patience, capable of slowing to a whisper during cold or scarcity, then quickening at the first touch of warmth. Comparative studies show that the genes managing this metabolic throttle, regulating oxygen use, energy storage, and enzyme efficiency, are ancient and conservative. They first evolved when polar nights required stillness instead of flight. Today, they persist in desert lizards that nap through droughts, in snakes that fast through winters, in turtles that lower their heartbeat to survive frozen ponds. The script is the same, only the stage has changed. These inheritances are not limited to a few species. They echo across the web of life. Shade tolerance in plants, seasonal breeding in animals, the ability to store fats, to migrate, to hibernate. All are responses shaped in part by the experiments of a restless Earth. The warm poles of the past were laboratories of adaptation, where organisms faced not monotony, but flux, and those experiments left their marks. The genes that help a spruce tree manage a long Scandinavian winter or allow a salmon to time its migration to temperature and light are distant cousins of the same solutions tested under the dim Eocene skies of Antarctica. Modern genomics lets us read these old blueprints in surprising detail. Scientists can now trace the ancestry of light-sensitive proteins, of drought response genes, of hormonal pathways that regulate sleep and growth. They find evidence of duplication and repurposing, ancient genes modified for new environments, like tools reforged for different tasks. The code evolves, but it rarely starts from scratch. The lesson buried in these sequences is simple and humbling. Life remembers what works. We often think of evolution as progress, a forward march toward complexity. But in truth, it is accumulation, a long memory written in chemistry. Every adaptation is both new and old, a remix of successful patterns that have navigated the planet's shifting moods. The forests that once shaded Antarctica are gone, but their instructions remain scattered in the living archive of cells. When modern species face droughts, floods, or the unfamiliar timing of seasons, they reach instinctively for these old notes, revising them, testing them again. In that way, the green Antarctica never truly disappeared. It persists in the capacity of life to adjust, to read the environment and rewrite its own script accordingly. Evolution doesn't throw away useful wrenches. It keeps them close, passing them down generation after generation, sometimes hidden, sometimes obvious, always ready. The DNA of living conifers and insects and reptiles is a palimpsest, a layered manuscript where new chapters overwrite but never erase the old. Somewhere in that code lies a memory of twilight that lasted months, of rain that came in torrents, of warmth that faded into frost. It is not nostalgia, it is instruction. When the planet's climate stirs again, as it is doing now, life will not start from zero. It will consult those buried notes, the biochemical recollections of what it means to adapt. And it will try once more to choreograph survival to the changing tempo of the sky. When we first found the black seams buried in stone, we saw only fuel. The dense, gleaming rock broke under our picks and burned with a steady, hungry flame. It seemed a miracle. Fire drawn from the ground, a bottled sun from another age. We built our cities with it, powered our industries, brightened our nights. But what we were really burning was time itself. Compressed forests, ancient swamps, the breath of a million summers long gone. Each lump of coal was a page torn from the diary of Earth's warmth. And we fed those pages to our furnaces until the sky began to remember. For millions of years, the carbon that had once filled the air was locked safely underground. It was the residue of the very world we've been exploring in this story. The green Antarctica, the coal swamps of Gondwana, the lush epochs of carbon and heat. Plants drew down carbon dioxide, built their tissues from it, and when they died, the weight of sediment and time pressed that matter into stone. It was Earth's way of balancing the books, of tucking away excess warmth so that life could continue in moderation. When we unearthed those seams and set them alight, we reversed the equation. The ancient breath returned to the air, and the planet's long memory stirred. The irony is profound. By burning coal, we did not just release energy, we reawakened the climate that created it. We made the air more like it was when Antarctica was green. The difference is in the speed. Back then, warmth built over thousands, even millions of years, giving ecosystems time to shuffle, migrate, and evolve. Now it happens in centuries, perhaps decades, a blink in geological time. The same physics applies, but the tempo is ours. The planet adjusts to whatever song we play, and right now the music is fast. We know what a warm Earth looks like. The rocks tell us, ice retreats, sea levels climb, rain belts shift, and storms find new routes. Forests move poleward, deserts expand where once there were grasslands. The Antarctic story is not just a memory of paradise, it is a record of upheaval. Warmth at OE, the poles was not gentle. It remade coastlines, rearranged species, and erased whole ecologies before new ones formed. There were winners, yes, but they were few and temporary. The rest adapted or vanished. The fossil record is an atlas of both creativity and loss. To see coal as only fuel is to miss the greater message. Each seam is a fossil ecosystem, a compressed biography of climate change written in plant tissue. When we mine it, we uncover that history twice, once as matter, once as metaphor. Those ancient forests captured carbon to stabilize their world. We, in burning them, destabilize ours. It is a mirror we hold up to ourselves, showing that progress without proportion becomes recursion, the past replayed under brighter lamps. But the moral is not panic. The rocks do not scold. They simply illustrate scale. They show how easily climate can pivot, how coastlines redraw themselves, how fast rain and wind can rearrange the living map. They remind us that change does not ask permission. Yet they also show that life persists, that recovery, though long and uneven, is possible. The coal we burn came from resilience, from forests that regrew after fires and floods. The challenge is not to erase change, but to manage its tempo, to avoid turning a gradual waltz into a reckless sprint. In a way, we have become a geological force ourselves. We move more soil each year than rivers do. We alter the atmosphere faster than volcanoes. Our species is now one of Earth's agents of transformation. Unintentionally at first, deliberately now. The question is whether we can wield that power with the same patience that stone once had. Can we learn from the fossils we've exhumed? Can we take the long view, the one that sees centuries as paragraphs and ecosystems as sentences? If the past teaches anything, it is humility wrapped in responsibility. Antarctica's tropical past proves warmth at high latitudes is possible, even magnificent, but also costly. It tells us that climate is not fixed, that comfort zones migrate, and that equilibrium is an illusion built on temporary alignments. When those alignments shift, as they are doing now, the choice is whether to write the next chapter with foresight or to let geology seize the pen again. Coal once powered our rise. Now it narrates our reflection. It is both artifact and omen, the residue of an ancient summer and the spark of a future one. We hold in our hands the same material that once built forests across the southern world. The difference is intention. Those ancient trees never knew they were making a climate. We do. And with that knowledge comes the burden and the grace of deciding what kind of world our own layers will describe when the rocks, in their patient way, begin to tell our story. If the planet continues to warm, the edges of Antarctica may once again whisper green. Already satellites catch hints of moss spreading across the peninsula, algae blooming on melting snow, and patches of tundra reclaiming bare rock. These are not jungles, just small experiments in adaptation. But they are signs that the land remembers what it once was. Under a thickening greenhouse sky, models show that air currents will strengthen, the hydrological cycle will intensify, and climate zones will migrate poleward, chasing comfort. The ice, though ancient and stubborn, is not invincible. It listens to the atmosphere's tone, and that tone, for now, is rising. To imagine a truly forested Antarctica, a revival of the lush world buried beneath miles of ice, would require deep, persistent change. The circumpolar current that now girdles the continent would have to falter or shift, allowing warm waters from lower latitudes to reach the southern shores. Winds would have to soften, mountain ranges erode or sink, and sea ice diminish for millennia. The planet has done this before, but it takes patience measured in millions of years. In the near future, only the margins will respond. The fringes of the peninsula, the coastal islands, the low valleys where glacial tongues retreat and leave behind raw soil ready for colonization. In those places, life will not wait for an invitation. Spores and seeds, carried by wind or seabird, will find the thawing ground. Mosses will form carpets where ice once ruled. Lichens will trace color into stone. Small grasses will take hold, bending under endless daylight, followed by insects feeding on the first decaying leaves. The green will come in cautious steps, as it always does, testing each threshold, withdrawing when conditions snap back. It will not be a return of Eden, but a rehearsal, a reminder that warmth, once released, always invites life to follow. Still, the idea of a green Antarctica provokes both awe and unease. We know now that beauty and upheaval often share the same threshold. The same forces that melt glaciers open routes for rainforests to advance. And the same feedbacks that spark new growth also raise seas, shift storms, and redraw coastlines elsewhere. Warmth is not free. Every degree reshuffles the deck. What thrives here may wither there. To look forward and see greenery spreading at the world's end is not necessarily comfort. It is warning written in chlorophyll. Earth's climate is a web of levers and loops. The Antarctic ice sheet is one of its great stabilizers, reflecting sunlight, cooling oceans, anchoring winds. As it shrinks, that balance wobbles. Meltwater freshens the surrounding seas, altering currents that, in turn, govern heat distribution across the planet. A weaker circumpolar current could let warmth creep farther south, accelerating ice loss. Clouds may trap more heat. Dark oceans may absorb more sunlight. Feedbacks multiply quietly, each one small, but together they write new conditions faster than the biosphere can revise its script. The lesson of every past transition, from the green poles of the Eocene to the icehouse of the Pleistocene, is that thresholds matter. Cross one, and the world begins to recompose itself. If Antarctica ever does green again, it will not happen alone. The same conditions that thaw its coasts will flood river deltas, parch equatorial forests, and upend rainfall where billions live. The poles and the tropics are bound by invisible strings. Pull one, and the other vibrates. Warmth that awakens life in one place will test it elsewhere. The planet, for all its vastness, moves as one body, and the pulse quickening in the south will be felt in the north. So the question isn't whether Antarctica could return to green. It could, given time and persistence. But whether that is the story we want to write. The forests of the past did not ask permission to form. They arose because the physics allowed them. Our influence on those physics is deliberate now, not accidental. The levers are in our hands. How much carbon we emit, how much ice we allow to vanish, how deeply we alter the composition of air and sea. Oceans and orbits still decide the tempo, but carbon chooses the key. Perhaps one day far in the future, travelers will stand where glaciers once towered and find willows growing beside new rivers, the wind carrying a scent of wet soil. They may marvel at how the planet remade itself, how life found another shape. But we are not passive spectators in that transformation. The story of a green Antarctica, if it comes again, will be a reflection of the choices we made. The balance between curiosity and caution, invention and restraint. The continent that once recorded the Earth's climate experiments is now a participant in ours. And the ending, as always, will depend on how well we listen to the feedbacks we are beginning to awaken. Close your eyes and imagine the sound first. A slow dripping that becomes a trickle, then a chorus of water finding its way downhill. The ice, long immovable, begins to sigh. It doesn't shatter or roar, it simply loosens. Melt channels thread through its heart, carrying the sky downward. The white surface softens, folds, and retreats, pulling back like a curtain that's been drawn too long. Beneath it, the earth exhales, revealing textures unseen for millions of years. Stone polished by pressure, valleys carved into memory, beaches dark and slick with the rebirth of water. The white veil lifts, and beneath it, a green page begins to show. The first light that reaches this newly bared land feels older than the sun. It falls across wet sand where no tide has touched since before there were humans. Driftwood, perhaps carried from faraway coasts, lodges on a beach that was ice just yesterday. Algae bloom in the runoff, staining the meltwater gold and crimson. A fern uncoils in a crevice, its spiral slow but certain. It is not resurrection, not exactly, but recognition. The land remembers how to be warm. The rivers wake next. They find their ancient beds, like old travelers rediscovering a path home. Channels that once froze mid-sentence finish there. Thought, threading through the valleys with quiet determination. The sound is both familiar and new, a murmuring that seems to speak directly to the bones of the planet. As the flow deepens, sediment stirs, carrying the ghosts of forests that once stood here. Bits of coal, fragments of pollen, the molecular whispers of what used to be. The air changes too. It thickens with moisture, filled with the scent of minerals and thawing soil. Bacteria and fungi long locked in ice blink into activity, rejoining the cycle of decay and renewal. Lichens reclaim stone, stitching color into the gray. Where meltwater pools, insects arrive. Winged emissaries from the north, following the warmth like pilgrims. A few hardy grasses take hold, bending in the wind that has never before smelled of soil. As the landscape adjusts, the animals follow. Birds trace new migration routes, testing the air. Seals haul out on shores that used to be cliffs of frozen glass. Whales thread along the coast, their songs echoing differently now that the sea ice no longer muffles sound. Perhaps, in some distant century, reptiles return to the edges of this reclaimed continent, descendants of those who once basked here when the sun rode higher. Their shadows stretch across the water, long and sinuous, like a signature repeated from memory. The transformation is not a prophecy. It is empathy made visible, an acknowledgement that the earth has done this before and could again. The actors change, but the stage remains, and the script is written not in fate, but in feedbacks. Warm currents play the strings of the ocean, winds tug the curtains of cloud. Carbon thickens the air like stage fog. It's the same theater that has hosted ice ages and tropical interludes, mass extinctions and new beginnings. The show never ends. It only changes lighting. And we, the late arrivals in the audience, sit wiser than those who came before. We've read the script in the rocks. We know how each act ends and how the next begins. We've traced the coal seams that tell of forested poles, the ash layers that mark eruptions, the isotope signatures that whisper of temperature swings. We know that beauty can rise from catastrophe, and that catastrophe is just another form of transition. The challenge is no longer comprehension, it's participation. Do we clap for the scene unfolding, or do we learn from it? In the imagination, the newly revealed Antarctica glows softly in twilight. The ice is not gone everywhere. Ridges and caps remain, but the coasts gleam with rivers and moss, and the low valleys breathe mist. The air hums with life, beginning to test the edges of possibility. The continent that once held silence now holds a different kind of quiet. The hush before a new ecology writes itself into being. To picture this is not to predict it. It is to feel the range of what Earth can be. The planet is not fragile in the way we are. It shifts, rebalances, reinvents. We are the transient ones, witnesses to a performance that began before our kind and will continue long after. Yet in this imagining lies something sacred, the understanding that we are part of the cast, not separate from the stage. The ice withdraws, the rivers sing, the green spreads, tentative but insistent. And in the audience of deep time, we watch, hearts full of recognition. We know this act, and yet it feels new each time. The world turns its page, and we, tiny scribes in its margin, can only whisper back, we remember this story. We end where we began, with a map and a clock. Spread it out in your mind, the familiar globe, the white halo at its base. And remember how we've unpinned it, how we've watched it drift through epochs and climates, through forests and floods and frost. Antarctica has worn many faces, none of them false. It has been jungle green, river braided, humid and humming with life. It has been a quiet desert of ice and wind. It has been both and will be again. The rocks do not argue, they testify. They keep their memories beneath the weight of silence, patient as only stone can be. If this comforts you, rest in that comfort. Change is ancient and survivable. The earth is not fragile in the way we imagine. It endures, even when it transforms. Every shift in temperature, every rearranged coastline, every extinction and rebirth is a sentence in a story still being written. To read it is to understand that permanence was never promised, but resilience was always possible. The forests that once brushed the Antarctic wind are gone, yet their imprint lingers in genes, in coal, in the slow rhythm of photosynthesis that continues elsewhere. The garden is not lost, it has simply moved. But if this thought stirs something instead of soothing it, if it leaves you restless or uncertain, let that stirring be gentle, not fearful. Because while change may be inevitable, the shape it takes is still being drafted. Choices matter even inside long arcs. Our presence in this story is brief, but it is not without agency. We too are geological for a moment. We shift carbon, redirect rivers, rewrite boundaries of air and sea. The pen is in our hands, though the ink is shared with oceans, winds, and time itself. The question is not whether the earth will continue, but what kind of story it will tell about us when we become another layer in its archive. The map you hold, whether in your imagination or on a glowing screen, shows a frozen south, a blank expanse labeled simply Antarctica. But maps freeze moments, and continents don't. Beneath that white lies the trace of rivers, deltas, and floodplains, the ghosts of forests that once listened to thunder. Beneath the ice are valleys that have not felt sunlight in millions of years, and if they ever do again, they will remember how to grow green. The world has cycles deeper than memory. Nothing here is truly over. It is merely between chapters. We have drifted far tonight, through timescales too vast to hold in waking thought. We have walked among fern thickets under midnight suns, watched crocodiles glide through tea-colored rivers, traced the fingerprints of warmth left in coal and stone. We've seen glaciers rise like walls and retreat like breath, and felt the planet's long pulse beneath it all. If your mind feels heavy with it, that's all right. The scale of Earth humbles everyone who listens. It should. Now, let the clock slow. Picture the south as it is tonight. The ice stretching under stars, the wind sweeping over sastrugi ridges, the faint crack of sea ice breaking in the distance. Above it all, auroras move like slow fire, green, violet, gold, echoes of the forests that once grew below. The air is thin but alive, the same air once filtered through leaves we've long forgotten. You can almost hear the planet breathe. Thank you for drifting through deep time with Moonlight Science. If this journey soothed your curiosity, if it filled you with a sense of wonder for the world beneath your feet, press like, subscribe, and tell me where under tonight's sky you're listening from. These stories are not just about the past. They are lullabies for a living world, songs that remind us how much there is to love, even as everything shifts. Breathe in, feel the long rhythm of the planet move through you, the rise and fall of warmth, of ice, of life. Breathe out. Let the timeline blur. Somewhere under the stars, the white veil sleeps, and beneath it, the green page waits. The garden isn't gone. It's just between chapters.